The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the park. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind that made the leaves shimmer like gold as they danced in the breeze. Eleanor Thompson, an 89-year-old war veteran, sat alone on a park bench. Her back straight and her posture proud, she took in the peaceful surroundings, her hands folded neatly in her lap. To anyone passing by, she was just another elderly woman enjoying the quiet of the day, but there was more to Eleanor than met the eye. She had lived a full life, one filled with love, loss, and sacrifice. A nurse during World War II, Eleanor had witnessed horrors no one should ever see, but she had always emerged stronger. She had learned that strength wasn't just about physical power, but about resilience, grace, and the ability to find peace amidst the chaos. As she sat there, her thoughts drifting between memories of the past and the serenity of the present, she heard the unmistakable sound of wheels on pavement. A cyclist was speeding down the path, weaving in and out of the trees with reckless abandon. Eleanor didn't think much of it at first, but as the cyclist neared her bench, something unexpected happened. The young man, barely out of his 20s, swerved slightly to avoid a jogger and, without warning, his bike brushed past Eleanor. The momentum sent her wide-brimmed hat flying off her head and onto the grass. "Hey, watch it," Eleanor called out, her voice sharp. But the cyclist didn't stop. Instead, he slowed just enough to glance back at her, his lips curling into a smirk. "Whoops. Sorry, Grandma," he said with a dismissive chuckle, not bothering to turn back or offer any kind of apology. Eleanor froze, a mixture of anger and disbelief filling her chest. Grandma. The word stung more than she expected. She had spent her whole life fighting to be seen as more than just an old woman, and here was this young man, completely dismissing her with a single word. For a moment, she considered shouting after him, demanding an apology, but then she stopped. She wasn't a fighter anymore, not in the way she once was. She had learned that responding in anger didn't solve anything. Still, the sting of the insult lingered. She bent down slowly to pick up her hat, her hands trembling just a little as she straightened it. A few people nearby had witnessed the incident, their heads turning in curiosity. But no one stepped in. No one offered to help. It was just Eleanor and the young cyclist, and in that moment, she felt small, invisible even. But Eleanor Thompson wasn't someone who stayed down for long. She stood up, her shoulders back and her head held high. She wasn't going to let some rude stranger ruin her day, or let him define her. As she started to walk toward the cyclist, something inside her stirred. She had faced far worse challenges in her lifetime. Real challenges, ones that tested her very soul. And she wasn't about to let a disrespectful young man be the thing that broke her. How would you handle this situation? Eleanor thought. Would you stand up for yourself? Or would you stay silent? What would you do in Eleanor's shoes? Would you have confronted him? Or let it go? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The tension of the moment was thick in the air as Eleanor walked confidently toward the young man. The world seemed to slow down as she approached. It wasn't just about the insult. It was about showing the world that she wasn't just an old woman to be dismissed. As Eleanor walked toward the cyclist, her mind wandered back to a time when she was younger, much younger, and the world was a much different place. Eleanor Thompson hadn't always been a grand motherly figure sitting on park benches in the afternoons. No, she had once been a nurse in World War II, a time when the world was engulfed in chaos and heroes were born from tragedy. She was only 19 when she enlisted, full of hope and determination to make a difference. Born and raised in a small town in the Midwest, Eleanor had never imagined that she would one day find herself on the front lines of one of the bloodiest wars in history. But when the call for volunteers went out, she knew that she couldn't stay behind. She wanted to serve her country, to help those who were injured and in need. At the time, Eleanor wasn't thinking about how her life would change forever, how the war would test her in ways she couldn't yet understand. She wasn't thinking about the loss, the fear, or the loneliness that would come with being miles away from home, surrounded by the sound of gunfire and the cries of soldiers who would never return. But she was thinking about something else, purpose. Eleanor believed in the cause, and she believed in her ability to make a difference, no matter how small. As a nurse, she saw the worst of humanity, but she also saw the best. She treated soldiers from every walk of life, each one carrying their own stories, their own burdens. It was in those moments, in the quiet of the hospitals, that Eleanor found her strength. Eleanor had always been a natural caregiver. Whether it was patching up the neighborhood kids after a scrape or sitting at the bedside of a dying soldier, she had an innate ability to calm and heal, to offer solace in the most difficult of times. She was the kind of woman who made others feel safe, even in the face of their greatest fears. But the war changed her in ways that no one could prepare for. She lost friends, good friends, on the battlefield. She held the hands of men who would never return to their families, who would never see another sunrise. And through it all, she held on to one belief, that life was precious, that every moment mattered. It was in those dark times that she met Thomas, a fellow soldier, who would become her husband. Thomas was strong, compassionate, and unafraid to fight for what was right. They bonded over their shared experiences, and in a world torn apart by violence, they found a quiet corner of peace in each other. They married just before the war ended, and for a while, Eleanor thought she could leave the horrors of war behind. But even in the peaceful years after, the memories never fully left her. The war had changed her, and no amount of time could erase the scars, physical or emotional. She had seen too much, felt too much, to ever be the same. And then there was the loss. Thomas died unexpectedly a few years after their marriage, taken by an illness that lingered in the background of their life together. The pain of losing him was something Eleanor had never truly recovered from, though she had learned to live with it. Now, at 89, Eleanor had grown accustomed to solitude. Her children were grown and had their own families, and though she loved them dearly, there were times when the silence felt like an old friend. She had buried most of her old grief and carried the memories of those she loved with her. But the years had not dulled her sharpness, her wit, or her resilience. As Eleanor neared the cyclist, her steps grew more determined. She wasn't just walking toward Jake, the young man who had disrespected her. She was walking toward her own strength, toward the woman she had become after decades of pain, love, loss, and resilience. The years had taught Eleanor to be patient, but they had also given her the courage to stand up for herself when needed. And today, she would stand tall once again. Eleanor's past has shaped her into the woman she is today. Have you ever had an experience in your life that changed you completely? What did you learn from it? Let's talk about it in the comments below. The encounter with the cyclist left Eleanor feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment, but she didn't let it linger. She had done what she set out to do, and now it was time to return to her routine. She took a slow breath, allowing the cool breeze to brush past her face, and leaned back against the bench, her hands folding neatly in her lap. The park was quiet once more, save for the rustling of the leaves overhead and the distant chatter of families enjoying the afternoon. But her peace didn't last long. Within minutes, she noticed the cyclist, Jake, coming back toward her, this time at a slower pace, his feet almost dragging along the path. He was no longer riding recklessly. Instead, he seemed to be lost in thought. He approached her cautiously, as if unsure of his next move. "Hey," he said, his voice softer now, without the arrogance that had marked their earlier interaction. Eleanor turned to him with a raised eyebrow. "Back again?" she asked, her tone curious but not unfriendly. Jake stopped a few feet away, his bike still between them. He looked down at the ground for a moment, shifting from foot to foot, then took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about what you said," he started. "And I guess I didn't really get it before. I wasn't thinking about how I made you feel. Or anyone, really." Eleanor nodded, acknowledging his words. She knew that this moment wasn't about being right. It was about helping someone see the world from a different perspective. She had hoped this conversation would make him reflect, but hearing him admit it was something else entirely. "I guess we all have our bad days," she said with a knowing smile. "But you can always change if you choose to. It's never too late to do better." Jake met her gaze, and for the first time, Eleanor saw something other than defensiveness or cockiness in his eyes. There was a genuine understanding, a glimmer of something more. "I want to do better," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I don't want to be that guy anymore." Eleanor's smile softened. She had seen this before. People who had the potential for growth, who just needed someone to show them the way. And here was Jake, a young man who had taken the first step. That, she knew, was the hardest part. "I think you're on the right path," Eleanor replied, her voice full of warmth. "Now, just keep walking down it, one step at a time." Jake seemed to absorb her words, nodding slowly. After a few moments of silence, he straightened up and glanced back at his bike. "Thanks," he said, his voice sincere, "for saying what you said. I think I needed it." With that, he turned and began to ride away, his pace slower than before, but this time with a sense of purpose behind it. Eleanor watched him for a moment, her heart swelling with pride. She didn't need to see the change right away. She had already seen it in the way he spoke, in the way he thought about his actions. That was enough. As she sat there, Eleanor couldn't help but reflect on her own journey. Her life had been full of challenges, yes, but it had also been filled with opportunities to teach, to guide, to make a difference. She had spent decades learning about resilience and kindness, about the power of living a life that mattered. And as she had grown older, she had come to realize that it wasn't just about surviving the years. It was about passing on what she had learned, to her children, to her community, and to anyone willing to listen. Jake's visit was a reminder that it wasn't too late to make an impact, no matter how old you were. Every interaction, no matter how small, could set off a ripple effect. Perhaps he would go on to teach others the same lesson she had just taught him. Perhaps the simple act of standing up for herself had ignited something inside him that would change the course of his day, and maybe even his life. Eleanor leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment, savoring the tranquility of the park. She felt lighter now, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. And as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and orange, Eleanor realized something else. That the most important lessons in life weren't always the ones you taught, but the ones you passed on by example. She had spent her life giving, and today, she had given something more precious than anything she had received. She had given respect, both to herself and to the young man who had needed it most. Eleanor's conversation with Jake sparked a change in him. Have you ever had a moment where someone's words made you rethink your actions? Or where you were the one who helped someone else see things differently? Share your thoughts and stories below. The following days felt quieter for Eleanor. Jake's unexpected visit had left a lasting impression on her. She hadn't anticipated the conversation to have such an impact on her own heart, but it did. There was something deeply fulfilling about seeing someone, especially someone so much younger, take a moment to reflect on their actions, to realize they could be better. However, life in the park went on. The regulars passed by, families, joggers, and dog walkers, all caught up in their own little worlds. Eleanor resumed her peaceful routine of people watching, quietly enjoying the comfort of the familiar. One afternoon, as Eleanor sat on her usual bench, she noticed something different. A young woman sitting alone on the swing, eyes focused on the ground, lost in thought. Her shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her. Eleanor had always been observant, and there was something about this woman that reminded her of her own struggles when she was young. The way she sat, hunched and weary, suggested that she carried a burden that no one could see. Eleanor didn't hesitate. Her instincts told her that this was another moment, another opportunity to pass on a lesson. She stood up slowly, her joints aching slightly as she walked over to the swings. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. "Mind if I sit for a moment?" she asked gently. The young woman looked up, startled, but then nodded silently. Eleanor took a seat on the swing next to her, not immediately pushing for a conversation. She knew better than to rush. Sometimes, it took a little time for people to open up. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound being the creaking of the swings and the occasional rustle of leaves. Eleanor waited, allowing the young woman her space. It was clear that she was struggling, but what was she struggling with? "I know that look," Eleanor finally said, breaking the silence. "It's the kind of look someone gets when they've been carrying a lot for too long." The young woman looked at her, a small frown on her face. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice quiet but not dismissive. "I see it all the time, darling," Eleanor said softly, her voice full of empathy. When life gets heavy and no one knows, the quiet weight that drags you down, it's not always the things people can see on the outside, is it? It's the stuff we keep hidden. The grief, the regret, the stress. The young woman's eyes softened, as if Eleanor had spoken a truth that she hadn't been able to express. She hesitated for a moment, then finally spoke up. I lost my job last week, and I don't know what to do. I've been looking for another one, but it feels like I'm just hitting dead ends. It's like no one's hiring, and every time I apply, I get rejected. I feel like I'm failing. Eleanor nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. She had seen so many people, young and old, face setbacks like this. The frustration, the sense of helplessness, the feeling that the world was closing in. She had seen it in herself when life had seemed unkind, when the dreams she once had seemed so far out of reach. But those experiences hadn't broken her, they had shaped her. She took a moment to find the right words. "You're not failing," Eleanor said gently. "You're just in a hard spot, and it's okay to feel lost for a little while. That doesn't make you a failure. It makes you human." The young woman's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. Instead, she wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed. Eleanor reached over, resting a hand on the young woman's arm. "Hey, it's okay," she said softly. "I've been there. It feels like everything is falling apart, but let me tell you something. It's in those moments, the ones where you're the most unsure, that you find out who you really are. It's in those moments that you build resilience." She paused, letting her words settle in. "And sometimes, the world is just waiting for you to find your feet. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You just have to keep going. Keep trying." The young woman looked up at Eleanor, her face a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't know who to talk to, and I felt so alone." Eleanor gave her a kind smile. Sometimes, all we need is someone to remind us that we're not alone. It doesn't matter how old we are. We all face hard times, and we all get through them, one step at a time. The young woman nodded, her shoulders loosening as if the weight had been lifted, even if just a little. For the first time since they had begun talking, she gave Eleanor a genuine smile. "I think you're right," she said, a spark of determination in her eyes. "I'm not going to give up. I'll figure it out." Eleanor smiled warmly, watching the young woman's renewed sense of hope. She knew it wasn't a magic fix. Life rarely worked that way, but it was a start. It was a shift in perspective, a reminder that no one is truly alone, no matter how much it feels like it. As the young woman got up to leave, she turned back to Eleanor. "Thank you again," she said, her voice full of appreciation. Eleanor simply nodded, her heart light. She had given what she could, and now it was up to the young woman to carry on with it. Have you ever faced a moment where someone's words or actions gave you the encouragement you needed? What's the best piece of advice someone has given you when you were struggling? Share your thoughts with us below. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. Eleanor had returned to her bench, content with the connection she'd made with the young woman. The world felt quieter now, as if the park itself was at peace, holding the stories of the countless lives that crossed it every day. Eleanor thought back on her years, on the wisdom she had gained through the struggles and triumphs of her own life. She had learned, after all, that it wasn't the big moments but the small, seemingly insignificant ones that often made the most difference. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar, yet unexpected, sound, the click of a bicycle's gears and the soft whir of the tires against the pavement. Eleanor turned her head and, to her surprise, saw Jake again. This time, he wasn't riding with the usual carefree speed. Instead, he had a calm and steady pace as he approached her. He was still wearing his workout clothes from before, but his expression was much more thoughtful. When he saw Eleanor, he waved, a shy smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Mind if I sit down?" Jake asked as he stopped near the bench. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, but gestured to the empty seat beside her. "Of course, Jake. But what brings you back here?" Jake took a seat slowly, placing his bike on the ground next to him. He paused, clearly trying to find the right words. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day. About doing better, you know? And I think I need to make some changes. Eleanor nodded slowly, giving him space to continue. She had known he would come back. People like Jake didn't change overnight, but they were capable of great things when given the right encouragement. It seemed like the first step had been taken. I didn't want to just talk about it, Jake went on, his voice quieter now. I actually signed up for some volunteer work, helping out at a food bank this weekend. I thought, maybe it could help me understand things better. Maybe help me do something good. Eleanor's heart swelled with pride. I'm glad to hear that, Jake. Sometimes, it's the act of giving that teaches us the most about ourselves. You might just find that by helping others, you also heal a part of yourself. Jake nodded, his eyes focused on the ground for a moment, clearly reflecting on her words. Then, as if a new thought had crossed his mind, he looked up again. Actually, that's not all, he said, hesitating for a moment. I also wanted to apologize for the way I acted before, the way I talked to you, the way I treated people in general. I was caught up in my own stuff and didn't see how my actions were affecting others. And I realize now that's no excuse. Eleanor smiled gently. I'm glad you're realizing that, Jake. Apologizing is never easy, but it's a powerful thing to do. And you didn't just apologize. You showed me that you're willing to make it right through your actions. Jake looked relieved, but there was still a trace of uncertainty in his eyes. I just hope it's not too late, you know? I feel like I've wasted so much time being selfish. Eleanor shook her head, her voice soft but firm. It's never too late to start fresh, Jake. Life doesn't keep track of your past mistakes the way you do. What matters is what you do from here on out. You have control over that. You always have. For a moment, the two of them sat in silence, the quiet peace of the park surrounding them. Jake seemed deep in thought, his eyes tracing the path before them, and Eleanor could tell he was wrestling with his past choices. But she could also tell that a shift had occurred. The young man who had once ridden by her without a second thought was now a person who was taking responsibility and making plans to be better. So, what's next for you? Eleanor asked, breaking the silence. Jake smiled, a genuine grin this time, one that reached his eyes. Next, I'm going to keep volunteering. And maybe one day, I'll get into something more long-term. I don't know where it'll lead, but at least I'm on the right path now. Eleanor nodded, satisfied with his words. That's the spirit, Jake. It's a journey. And journeys don't always follow the path we expect them to, but they always lead us to where we need to be. Just as she was about to speak again, a woman walking by with a stroller stopped and smiled warmly at Jake. Eleanor noticed the woman's eyes brighten as she spotted him. Jake? Is that you? Jake stood up quickly, a look of surprise crossing his face. Leah. Wow, I didn't expect to see you here. The woman, Leah, laughed lightly. I come to the park all the time with Emma. She gestured to the stroller, where a small child with curly hair and bright eyes waved excitedly. Jake crouched down to wave back at the little girl. Hey there, Emma. How's it going? Leah turned to Eleanor, her eyes kind but inquisitive. So, Jake, who's this? Jake hesitated for a moment, then smiled as he stood up. This is Eleanor. She gave me a bit of advice the other day, and I've been thinking about it ever since. Leah raised an eyebrow, clearly curious. Advice? What kind of advice? Jake looked over at Eleanor, who gave him an encouraging nod. She told me I needed to do better, and I've been trying to live by that ever since. I signed up to volunteer, and I'm really going to try to be a better person from here on out. Leah smiled warmly, her eyes softening. I'm proud of you, Jake. I'm glad you're taking those steps. You've always had the potential to do great things. Just remember, it's a process. Eleanor couldn't help but smile, watching the exchange. Jake was already sharing his journey with others, and while he might not have it all figured out yet, he was on the right track. As Leah and Jake chatted for a few more minutes, Eleanor couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. Another day, another small but meaningful connection made. And though she wasn't sure what would come next for Jake, she had no doubt that he was already starting to change for the better. Jake is beginning his journey of change, but it's clear that the road ahead isn't always easy. Have you ever taken the first step towards something better? What was it like for you? Let us know your experience below. The sun had set, casting an orange glow across the park, and the evening breeze had begun to chill the air. Eleanor remained seated on her favorite bench, her mind replaying the day's events. It had been another reminder of how small acts of kindness could ripple through people's lives, creating change in ways she couldn't have predicted. She felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that Jake was on a new path, taking the first real steps toward making a positive impact, not just on others, but on himself. But just as she settled into the comfort of the moment, another familiar sound broke the tranquility of the evening, a bike approaching. This time, it wasn't Jake. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. The cyclist, dressed in bright athletic gear, was fast approaching, weaving between the trees like a blur. For a moment, she wondered if it was another jogger or a fellow cyclist, but the closer the rider got, the more she realized it was someone she hadn't seen for quite a while. It was Kevin, the man who had been so rude to her a few weeks ago. Eleanor straightened up, her mind racing. Kevin hadn't forgotten about their last interaction, that much was certain. But had he? Did he even remember the incident? She recalled the sting of his words and the way he had treated her that day. It had been harsh, unjustified. Yet, something in her had held back, a quiet hope that one day he would realize his mistake. Kevin skidded to a stop in front of her bench, his breath quick and heavy from the ride. He looked around, as if unsure if anyone would be watching, and then his eyes locked with Eleanor's. "Eleanor," he greeted, almost awkwardly. He wiped the sweat from his brow, clearly uncomfortable. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her expression guarded. "Kevin," she replied coolly, not sure what to expect. Kevin hesitated, clearly struggling with his words. After a long pause, he spoke again, his voice quieter. "I've been thinking about what happened the other day. You know, when I was rude to you." He looked at her sheepishly. "I've had a lot of time to think about it, and I wanted to apologize." Eleanor blinked, surprised. She hadn't expected this, not from someone who had been so harsh just a few weeks ago. Yet, there was something in his voice, a sincerity she couldn't ignore. I didn't mean to be rude," Kevin continued. "I've been dealing with a lot of stress lately, work, personal stuff, and I guess I took it out on you. I was out of line, and I regret it." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her face softening. She had always believed in second chances, in the idea that people could change if given the right opportunity. But this wasn't just about him apologizing. It was about acknowledging that people, even the ones who hurt us, were capable of growth. "I understand," Eleanor said quietly. "We all have our struggles, Kevin, but that doesn't excuse the way we treat others. I'm glad to hear you've been thinking about it, though. It means something." Kevin nodded, visibly relieved that she wasn't rejecting his apology outright. "I've been making more of an effort to be kinder, to take a step back when I feel frustrated. It's not easy, but I know I need to change." Eleanor offered a small, knowing smile. "Change is never easy, Kevin, but it's always possible. And it starts with moments like this, recognizing when we've hurt someone and making it right." Kevin sighed, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since he had approached her. "I really appreciate you hearing me out. I don't expect you to forget what I did, but I hope this is a step toward making things right." "I don't forget easily," Eleanor replied. "But I do believe in the power of redemption. If you're truly trying, that's what matters." The two of them sat in silence for a moment, the only sound being the wind rustling through the trees. For Eleanor, it was a moment of quiet reflection. It wasn't every day that someone came back to make amends. It was a rare and beautiful thing, and she couldn't help but admire Kevin for taking the step. Eventually, Kevin stood up, ready to continue his ride. Before he left, he turned back to Eleanor. "Thank you. I'll keep trying. You've given me a lot to think about." Eleanor nodded, her heart warm. "You're welcome, Kevin. And remember, we're all on this journey together. It's never too late to change." As Kevin cycled away, Eleanor watched him go, her thoughts lingering on the conversation they had just shared. She knew it wasn't the end of the story. It never was. But something had shifted. Kevin wasn't the same person he had been when he first crossed her path. And that, in itself, was a victory. The park had become a place of transformation, not just for Eleanor, but for others as well. The ripple of kindness and understanding was spreading further than she could have imagined. And though she had always believed that everyone had the capacity to change, it was moments like this, when someone acknowledged their wrongs and chose to do better, that proved it. As she sat there, the sun almost fully set, Eleanor allowed herself a brief moment of peace. She was content in knowing that she had made a difference. And more than that, she realized that the power to create change didn't always lie in grand gestures or monumental actions. Sometimes it was the quiet, everyday moments, the ones when you chose to listen, to forgive, to encourage, that had the greatest impact. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone came back to apologize? How did it make you feel? Share your thoughts in the comments below. As the days passed, the park seemed to become a place of quiet reflection and unexpected moments. Eleanor had always known that her time there, though simple, held the potential to shape the world around her. The kindness she had extended to Jake and Kevin seemed to have planted seeds of change, but there was more to this place than she realized. One late afternoon, Eleanor settled into her usual bench, content with the peaceful hum of the park. It was a clear day, the sky painted in soft hues of pink and lavender as the sun began to set. The children on the playground were winding down, and the usual joggers and cyclists had slowed their pace. It was one of those rare moments of quiet, just before the park transformed into a stillness that made everything seem more profound. Eleanor was lost in thought when a voice interrupted her reverie. "Mind if I sit?" Eleanor looked up to see an older woman standing in front of her, holding a walking cane. The woman had a warm, approachable demeanor, with silver hair neatly pulled back and glasses perched on the tip of her nose. "Of course, dear," Eleanor replied with a smile. "It's a lovely day, isn't it?" The woman nodded, taking a seat beside Eleanor. "It sure is. I come here to clear my mind sometimes. You know, life has a way of overwhelming you, doesn't it?" Eleanor chuckled softly. "It does indeed. But sometimes, a quiet moment like this can make everything feel more manageable." The woman looked at her, her eyes twinkling. "You sound like someone who's lived through a few things. Mind if I ask your name?" "I'm Eleanor," she said, offering her hand. "And you are?" "I'm Grace," the woman replied, shaking Eleanor's hand gently. "I'm new to the area. Just moved here a few months ago. It's nice to finally find a peaceful spot like this." Eleanor nodded. "I've been coming to this park for years. It's my little slice of serenity. I suppose, after a certain age, you start to appreciate the quiet more than anything else." Grace smiled knowingly. "I can imagine. I'm not quite as old as you," she teased, "but I'm getting there. I don't mind the quiet, though. It gives you space to think." Eleanor couldn't help but laugh. There was something comforting about Grace's presence, a kind of kinship between two people who had lived enough to understand the value of quiet reflection. "I'll admit," Grace continued, "I've been feeling a little lonely since I moved here. My husband passed away a year ago, and I've been trying to figure out how to fill the space he left behind." Eleanor's heart softened. She had felt that loneliness too, after losing her own husband many years ago. The kind of loneliness that wasn't just about being physically alone, but about the absence of the shared moments, the routines, the laughter. "I understand," Eleanor said gently. "I lost my husband some years ago, and while time helps, it never quite fills that void. But you learn to adjust. You find new ways to fill your time, even if it's in small ways." Grace sighed, nodding. "I suppose that's true. But it's still hard, you know? I used to go everywhere with him. Now, I'm still figuring out how to do things on my own." Eleanor smiled softly. "That's the thing about life, isn't it? It keeps going, no matter how many people we lose along the way. But we adapt, and eventually, we find ways to keep moving forward. Sometimes, those ways come from the most unexpected places." Grace turned to Eleanor, her expression thoughtful. "You make it sound easy, but I know it's not. Maybe that's why I'm still struggling. I don't know where to start." Eleanor looked at the sky, watching as the colors deepened, reflecting on the many conversations she had had with herself through the years. "It's not easy, Grace. I won't pretend it is. But sometimes, you start by making small changes. Maybe you take a walk in the park, or you talk to someone like I'm talking to you now." Grace raised an eyebrow. "You mean, like a stranger?" Eleanor shrugged lightly. "Why not? Sometimes, The most unexpected connections are the ones that help us move forward. A simple conversation can lead to new things, new friendships, new possibilities. For a moment, the two women sat quietly, allowing the soft sounds of the park to fill the space between them. It was an unspoken understanding that both of them were in need of connection. Their shared solitude, in that moment, brought them together in a way neither had anticipated. "I suppose I could try that," Grace said finally, a soft smile forming on her lips. "Maybe it's time I stop hiding away." Eleanor nodded. "We all need people, Grace. And sometimes it takes a while to realize that the right people are out there, waiting for us to reach out." As the evening turned into night, Grace stood up slowly, adjusting her coat. "Well, I suppose I'll take your advice. I'll start with small steps, just like you said." Eleanor stood as well, feeling a deep sense of contentment. "That's the best way to start. And remember, you're not alone in this." Grace smiled warmly, her eyes sparkling. "Thank you, Eleanor. I think we're going to be good friends." Eleanor smiled back, feeling that familiar warmth in her chest. "I think so too, Grace. I think so too." As Grace walked away, Eleanor sat back down on the bench, watching the evening sky darken. She felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that once again, she had made a meaningful connection. And it wasn't just about helping someone else. It was about how those small moments, those conversations, could change the course of someone's day, their week, or even their life. In the weeks that followed, Grace and Eleanor began to meet at the park regularly. They shared stories, offered advice, and laughed about the simple things in life. It was a friendship born out of shared experiences, and one that brought both women comfort as they navigated their own journeys. Eleanor had learned long ago that life wasn't about waiting for big, dramatic moments. It was about finding the beauty in the quiet moments, in the people who crossed your path when you least expected it. And sometimes, those people became more than just passing strangers. They became friends, the kind who would walk with you through the difficult days and cheer you on through the better ones. Have you ever struck up an unexpected conversation with a stranger that turned into a lasting friendship? What was that experience like? Share your story in the comments below. It was a cold morning when Eleanor walked into the park, the chill of winter already beginning to creep through the air. She bundled herself up in her warm coat, scarf, and gloves, but she couldn't shake the thought that something had been weighing on her mind for weeks now. The park, which had once been her haven of peace, was becoming a place of reflection that brought her face to face with her own unresolved emotions. As she walked towards her usual bench, she noticed someone sitting on it, someone she hadn't expected to see again. Jake. He was the young man who had once been brash, defiant, and resistant to any sort of guidance. It had been a few weeks since their last conversation, but today, there was a different air about him. He was sitting on the bench with his hands folded in his lap, staring at the ground, lost in thought. Eleanor couldn't help but notice the heaviness in his posture. It was as if a weight had settled over him, and he was struggling to carry it. Eleanor approached slowly, her steps deliberate. When she was within earshot, she spoke softly. "Jake?" Jake looked up in surprise, as if he hadn't noticed her approach. His expression was a mixture of guilt and shame, emotions he wasn't used to wearing so openly. "Oh, hi, Eleanor," Jake said, his voice hesitant. Eleanor took a seat beside him without hesitation. She didn't ask what was wrong. She could tell that he was dealing with something, but it was his journey to share when he was ready. They sat in silence for a moment, the air crisp and still, the only sound being the distant calls of birds overhead. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice breaking the quiet. "I messed up, Eleanor. I really messed up." He looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting nervously. "I've been thinking about it, and I don't know what to do." Eleanor looked at him, her heart softening. It wasn't hard to see the pain in his eyes, the same pain she had seen in so many others who had struggled with their past mistakes. She knew that Jake had come to a realization, and it was clear that this moment was a pivotal one for him. "What happened, Jake?" she asked gently, her voice full of understanding. "What's weighing on you?" Jake took a deep breath, his gaze shifting to the distant horizon. "I hurt someone, a friend of mine. I let them down in a way I can't take back. I was selfish and I I don't know how to fix it. I keep thinking about how I treated them, and it makes me sick to my stomach." Eleanor's heart ached for him. She could hear the regret in his voice and see it in the way his shoulders hunched under the weight of his emotions. She had been there herself, carrying guilt for mistakes made, wondering if there was any way to undo the damage. "Jake," Eleanor said quietly, "there's nothing wrong with feeling regret. It means you understand what you did. But sometimes, the hardest thing we can do is forgive ourselves." Jake let out a bitter laugh. "Forgive myself? I don't think I deserve that. I hurt someone I cared about, and now they don't want anything to do with me. I feel like I ruined everything." Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder, a small gesture, but one that carried the weight of years of wisdom. "You can't change the past, but you can learn from it. You can apologize, and you can make amends. But you also need to let go of the guilt. It doesn't serve you, Jake. It only holds you back." Jake was quiet for a long time, processing her words. He had never been the type to open up, but in this moment, with Eleanor's steady presence beside him, he felt like maybe there was a way forward. "I've tried to apologize. I've tried to make it right, but I think they're just done with me." His voice cracked as he spoke. The vulnerability he had always kept hidden now laid bare. Eleanor gave him a kind, reassuring smile. "Sometimes, Jake, people need time. Not everyone will accept your apology right away, and that's okay. What matters is that you've acknowledged what you did, and you're trying to make things right. That's the first step. The next step is giving them the space they need, but never give up on being a better version of yourself. Time does heal wounds, but it requires patience and understanding." Jake nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. "I don't know if they'll ever forgive me, but I guess I have to live with that." "You don't have to live with the guilt, though," Eleanor said softly. "The important part is that you forgive yourself. It's part of the journey. And trust me, Jake, forgiveness is a gift you give to yourself." Jake stared at the ground for a moment, processing her words, and then something changed. A flicker of hope passed through his eyes, a sign that he was beginning to understand. "You really think I can move on from this?" Eleanor smiled warmly. "I know you can, but it starts with forgiving yourself and learning from the mistakes. You don't have to be perfect. None of us are. But you can always try to be better." For the first time in a long while, Jake felt lighter. The heaviness that had been holding him down began to dissipate, if only just a little. He realized that Eleanor was right. He couldn't change the past, but he could control the present. And perhaps, for the first time, he understood that self-forgiveness was a crucial part of moving forward. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. I think I know what I need to do now." Eleanor smiled softly, her heart warmed by his words. "Take it one step at a time, Jake. That's all you can do." As Jake stood up to leave, Eleanor watched him go, a sense of hope rising within her. She had helped him see that he wasn't defined by his mistakes, and that change was always possible. It was a lesson she had learned long ago, that sometimes the hardest person to forgive is ourselves. But once we do, the burden becomes lighter, and we are free to move forward. And as the park grew quieter with the approaching night, Eleanor sat back on her bench, knowing that she had once again made a difference in someone's life, simply by offering them a moment of understanding. Have you ever struggled with forgiveness, either towards someone else or yourself? How did you find peace in that process? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The weeks following Jake's emotional breakthrough were marked by change, not just in Jake, but in Eleanor as well. It was a subtle shift, but one that had a profound effect on the way she viewed her role in the world and the people she encountered. The simple act of helping Jake had reminded her of a lesson she had learned long ago. Life was not about avoiding mistakes, but about learning from them, making amends, and moving forward. Eleanor had always known that her purpose was to help others, but she hadn't expected the fulfillment it brought her to be so life-changing. In the days after her conversation with Jake, she noticed a lightness in her step that had been missing for quite some time. There was a new energy in her heart, one that filled her with hope and a renewed sense of purpose. It was another chilly afternoon in the park when she saw him again. Jake was sitting on a bench near the fountain, his head tilted as if deep in thought. The usual aura of uncertainty that had surrounded him seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a quiet confidence. Eleanor couldn't help but smile to herself. It was clear that he had taken her advice to heart. As she approached, she saw him looking up at the sky, his gaze lingering on the clouds that drifted lazily across the blue expanse. For a moment, it was as if he hadn't noticed her, but when she was close enough, he turned and gave her a small but genuine smile. "Hey, Eleanor," Jake greeted her warmly. "I was hoping I'd see you today." Eleanor sat down beside him, feeling a sense of pride well up inside her. "I wasn't sure you'd be here. You've been coming around more often lately." Jake shrugged, looking down at his hands for a moment before meeting her gaze again. "Yeah, well, I've been doing some thinking. You were right. I had to let go of the past and start doing the right things, even if it's hard." Eleanor nodded, the wisdom of her own experiences mirrored in his words. "And how's it been going?" Jake took a deep breath, his shoulders visibly relaxing. "It's been tough. I won't lie about that. But I've started reaching out to people. I've been trying to make things right with my old friend. I know it might take time, but I'm not giving up. I want to show them I've changed." Eleanor could see the determination in his eyes, and she was proud of the steps he had taken. "That's the spirit, Jake. Change isn't easy, and sometimes it doesn't happen overnight. But you've got the right mindset. Keep moving forward, one step at a time." For a moment, they sat together in silence, the sound of the fountain filling the space between them. Eleanor glanced around, taking in the peacefulness of the park, the quiet moments that allowed for reflection, growth, and, most importantly, second chances. "I've been thinking too," Jake continued, breaking the silence. "I know I can't undo the damage I've done, but I want to be someone who makes a difference in the world. Maybe I can't do it all at once, but I want to at least try." Eleanor's heart swelled with pride. "You're already doing it, Jake. Just by taking responsibility and trying to make things right, you're making a difference. You're showing people that it's never too late for a second chance." Jake looked down, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Yeah, I guess you're right. I've been so focused on the mistakes I've made that I forgot to focus on what I could do now. And maybe that's the hardest part, realizing that I don't have to keep carrying the burden of my past." Eleanor smiled warmly. "Exactly. The past doesn't define us, Jake. It's what we do with the present that matters most." Jake looked at her, a sense of gratitude in his eyes. "I don't think I ever would have gotten here without you, Eleanor. You've helped me more than you know." Eleanor chuckled softly. "You did all the hard work. I just offered a little guidance along the way." Jake smiled back, his expression more at ease than it had been the first time they had spoken. There was a sense of peace about him now, one that came from within, from the growth he had experienced in such a short time. As the two of them sat there in the fading light of the afternoon, Eleanor realized something important. Life didn't always offer us second chances in the traditional sense, but sometimes we had the opportunity to reinvent ourselves, to make amends, and to take control of our futures. And Jake, in his own way, was doing just that. In the weeks that followed, Jake continued to reach out to those he had wronged, and slowly but surely, he began to rebuild the relationships he had once taken for granted. Eleanor continued to be there for him, offering encouragement when needed, but mostly watching with pride as he took responsibility for his actions and worked toward making things right. But it wasn't just Jake who was learning and growing. Eleanor, too, was reminded of the power of redemption and forgiveness. The park, once a place of quiet solitude for her, had become a place of new beginnings, a place where second chances were not only possible, but essential. As she walked home one evening, the last rays of the sun casting a warm glow over the streets, Eleanor felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had helped someone find their way back to the path of redemption, and in doing so, she had rediscovered her own sense of purpose. The world was full of mistakes, regrets, and missteps, but it was also full of second chances, moments where we could choose to do better, be better, and make the world a little brighter in the process. Have you ever experienced a second chance in your life? How did it change you? Or perhaps you've given someone else a second chance. Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. It was an unusually warm spring day when Eleanor found herself at the park again. The trees had finally shed their winter coats, and the blossoms were beginning to bloom, filling the air with the sweet fragrance of new life. As she walked along the familiar path, her mind drifted back to the time she had spent with Jake, watching him grow and learn. His journey was far from over, but he had made great strides in the right direction. Eleanor's thoughts were interrupted when she spotted a familiar face across the park. She hadn't seen him in years, but the moment their eyes met, she knew exactly who it was. Tom. He was sitting on a bench near the large oak tree, his hands resting on his knees, and his posture slightly hunched. Tom had been one of Eleanor's closest friends many years ago, someone she had shared countless memories with. But like many relationships in life, theirs had drifted apart. There had been no falling out, just the slow fade that often happened when life pulled people in different directions. Still, seeing him again brought a rush of emotions she hadn't anticipated. She hadn't expected to encounter Tom here, of all places. It had been over a decade since they last spoke, and yet, in that moment, it felt as though no time had passed. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach. She hadn't planned on running into him, but here he was, sitting alone, just like she had once done all those years ago. Her heart beat a little faster as she walked toward him, the nervousness she hadn't felt in ages creeping up. When she was close enough, Tom looked up and saw her. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stared, as if trying to place her face in his memory. Then, recognition dawned. "Eleanor," he said, his voice soft, filled with disbelief. "Is that really you?" Eleanor smiled, her eyes sparkling with warmth. "Tom, it's been a long time." Tom stood up, his expression both surprised and filled with nostalgia. "I can't believe this. It's been, what, 10 years? More." "Something like that," Eleanor replied, laughing softly. "I never thought we'd run into each other like this." Tom chuckled, running a hand through his hair. "I know, right? I've been coming to this park for a while now, but I never expected to see you again." They stood there for a moment, the weight of the years between them hanging in the air. Eleanor could feel the awkwardness of the situation, but also the quiet excitement of reconnecting with someone from her past. "Why don't we sit down?" Tom suggested, gesturing to the bench. "We've got a lot of catching up to do." They both sat, and for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt a deep sense of peace. There was something comforting about reconnecting with someone who knew her from a different time, before everything had changed. Tom spoke first, breaking the silence. "So, what's been going on with you all these years?" "I'm sure a lot has happened." Eleanor smiled, thinking about how much she had learned and grown in the years since their paths had diverged. "Oh, you know, life's been full of surprises. I've spent a lot of time helping people. I found that's where my heart is, being there for others, guiding them when they need it most." Tom nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That sounds like you. You were always the one who looked out for everyone else, even when you didn't have to." Eleanor felt a rush of gratitude. It had always been a part of who she was, helping others, but hearing Tom say it out loud made her realize just how much of herself she had invested in others over the years. "And what about you?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "What's been going on in your life?" Tom sighed, leaning back against the bench, looking up at the sky. "It's been a bit of a roller coaster. I've had my fair share of struggles, lost some things along the way, but I've also found new things, new opportunities. It's been a mix of highs and lows, but I'm doing okay. I think I'm finally starting to figure things out." Eleanor could hear the sincerity in his voice, but there was also an undertone of regret, as if he had been carrying something with him for years. It wasn't unusual. Life had a way of leaving scars on people, no matter how strong they appeared on the outside. "Sometimes, we don't realize how much we've been carrying until we take a moment to sit and breathe," Eleanor said, her tone gentle. Tom nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yeah, you've always been good at seeing the bigger picture." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. For Eleanor, it was a reminder of the deep connections she had made in her life, relationships that had shaped her. For Tom, it seemed like an opportunity to reflect on where he had been and where he was going. Finally, he spoke again, his voice more earnest this time. "Eleanor, I know we've lost touch over the years, and I can't change that. But I want you to know something. I've thought about you a lot, especially in the last few months. You were always someone I could count on, someone who made me feel understood. I guess I took that for granted, and I'm sorry for that." Eleanor was surprised by his words. She hadn't expected an apology, especially not after so many years. But hearing it was like a weight being lifted off her shoulders. She had never held any ill will toward Tom, but there had always been a quiet sadness in her heart about how their friendship had faded. "Tom, you don't need to apologize. We were both young, and life had a way of pulling us in different directions. But I'm glad we're here now. I think we both learned something along the way." Tom looked at her, his eyes searching. "You think so?" Eleanor nodded, smiling softly. "I do. Maybe it's never too late to reconnect, and maybe we're both in a place where we can be there for each other again." Tom smiled in return, and for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt that familiar warmth in her chest, a feeling of having found something lost, a piece of her past that had come full circle. As they sat there, catching up on old times and talking about what the future might hold, Eleanor realized that life wasn't about holding on to the past or dwelling on what had been lost. It was about embracing the present, reconnecting when the time was right, and being open to new opportunities and friendships. And for the first time in years, she felt that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Have you ever reconnected with an old friend or lost touch with someone who was once important to you? How did that encounter change you? Share your experience in the comments below. The sun was beginning to set on another crisp evening when Eleanor received a phone call that would alter the course of her week. She had just returned from the park, still savoring the unexpected reunion with Tom, when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was from Jake. She answered the call immediately. "Eleanor?" Jake's voice sounded strained, an undercurrent of anxiety lacing his words. "Can we talk?" Eleanor felt a knot form in her stomach. Jake had made great strides in his personal journey, but she knew that old patterns could resurface at any time. "Of course, Jake. What's going on?" There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I messed up. I don't know how to fix this, but I need your help." Her heart sank. She could sense the desperation in his voice, but there was also a kind of humility, something that told her he wasn't the same person he had been just months ago. "I'm on my way," Eleanor replied without hesitation, already grabbing her coat from the hook by the door. Jake was sitting on the front steps of his apartment when Eleanor arrived, his face hidden in his hands. The glow of the streetlights cast a faint shadow over him, and for a moment, he looked smaller than he ever had before. Eleanor approached him quietly, not wanting to startle him. "Jake," she called gently, her voice soft. He looked up, and his eyes were filled with regret. "I messed up," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor sat beside him, offering him a moment of silence. There was no need for words just yet. She could tell that Jake needed to unload. After a moment, he took a deep breath and finally spoke. "I tried to reach out to Sarah again. You know, the friend I've been trying to make amends with. But I don't know. She doesn't want to talk to me. She says I've hurt her too much, and I don't blame her. I don't know how to fix this." Eleanor listened, her heart aching for Jake, but she could sense that this was another test for him. A moment where his growth would be measured not by how he fixed the situation, but by how he handled it. "You've come so far, Jake," she said, her voice steady. "But you have to understand, sometimes fixing things doesn't happen on our timeline. It doesn't happen as quickly as we want it to." "I know," he replied, wiping his face with the sleeve of his jacket, "but I want to prove to her that I've changed. I want her to see that I'm different." Eleanor nodded. "Proving you've changed doesn't mean forcing someone to forgive you, Jake. It means showing them, through your actions, that you're better than you were before. But that doesn't happen overnight." Jake took in a shaky breath. "I just don't know how much longer I can wait. I don't know if she'll ever believe me." Eleanor looked him in the eyes, trying to offer him the most honest advice she could. "You can't control what she does, Jake. You can't force her to forgive you. But what you can control is how you move forward. Keep being the person you are now. Keep doing the right thing. That's all you can do." Jake let out a long sigh, leaning back against the steps as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. I know you're right. I've just been afraid that my past is going to haunt me forever. It doesn't have to, Eleanor said, her voice firm but kind. Your past is part of who you are, yes, but it doesn't define you. It's your actions now that will define you. Not the mistakes you made, but the way you move forward from them. There was a long pause as Jake processed her words. The silence between them was thick with unspoken emotion, and Eleanor could feel the internal battle he was facing. His fear of rejection, his fear that he wasn't enough. It was all there, just beneath the surface. Finally, Jake spoke again, his voice quieter but filled with a new kind of resolve. I think I get it now. It's not about trying to fix everything all at once. It's about taking one step at a time and doing what I can, without expecting an immediate result. Eleanor smiled softly, relieved to see him coming to terms with the truth. Exactly. And you're not alone in this. You've already made progress, Jake. You just have to keep going. And eventually, things will fall into place. Jake looked at her, a grateful expression on his face. Thank you, Eleanor. I don't think I would have made it this far without you. Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder, offering him a gentle squeeze. You did all the hard work, Jake. You just needed a little guidance along the way. As they sat there, the quiet hum of the city surrounding them, Eleanor realized how much she had learned from Jake's journey as well. Her role in his life wasn't just about offering advice. It was about supporting him as he navigated his own path to redemption. And in doing so, she had learned to believe in the power of second chances once more. The next day, Jake called her again, and this time, there was something different in his voice, something lighter. Eleanor, I spoke to Sarah. She didn't forgive me right away, but she's willing to listen. She said we can talk again next week. Eleanor's heart lifted. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. A moment of clarity for Jake, a chance to show Sarah that he had truly changed. That's great news, Jake. I'm proud of you. I'm proud of me too, he said, and Eleanor could hear the smile in his voice. And I wouldn't be here without you. I wanted you to know that. Eleanor hung up the phone, a smile spreading across her face. She had always believed in the possibility of redemption, but hearing Jake speak those words made her realize just how far he had come. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories were the ones that didn't involve immediate results, but rather the growth and change that happened along the way. Have you ever felt like you were stuck in a situation that seemed impossible to fix? How did you handle it, and what did you learn in the process? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. The next few days passed in a blur of activity for Eleanor. Between working with Jake on his emotional journey and the occasional visit to the park where she would meet up with Tom, she found herself reflecting on the lessons she'd learned over the years. Her life had always been about helping others, but now, she was beginning to understand that sometimes, helping others meant giving them the space to figure things out for themselves. It was another morning when she received a call that would shake her in a way she wasn't prepared for. It was from her daughter, Kelly. Mom, I need to talk to you. Kelly's voice came through the phone, tight with worry. It's about Dad. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Her ex-husband, David, hadn't been in her life for years. Yet, his name still had the power to stir emotions in her. She had spent so long building her own life, moving forward after their divorce, that it was hard to believe he could still affect her this way. What's going on? Eleanor asked, her voice steady but with a hint of concern. He's in the hospital. It's serious, Mom. Kelly paused, her voice trembling slightly. I think you should come. Eleanor felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over her. Shock, fear, uncertainty. It had been decades since she had spoken to David. They had divorced under painful circumstances, and she hadn't thought about him much after that. He had remarried and had other children, and their worlds had remained separate. But Kelly was her daughter. And if there was one thing Eleanor had learned over the years, it was that family, no matter the broken parts, was still family. I'm on my way, Eleanor said, her voice calm despite the storm of emotions brewing inside her. The hospital was busy, as always. Eleanor navigated the sterile hallways with Kelly at her side, her daughter's hand tightly gripping hers. She could see the worry in Kelly's eyes, the uncertainty that came with the news of her father's condition. When they reached David's room, Eleanor hesitated at the door. She hadn't seen him in so long, and the idea of facing him again, especially in such a vulnerable state, made her uneasy. Kelly noticed her hesitation. "Mom, I know this is hard, but he needs you." Eleanor nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. David lay in the hospital bed, looking smaller than she remembered. His once strong, confident posture was now replaced by fragility. The tubes and machines that surrounded him made it clear just how serious his condition was. He looked up when they entered, his eyes tired but filled with recognition. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice raspy. "I didn't think you'd come." Eleanor stood at the foot of the bed, her arms crossed in front of her. There was so much history between them, so many unresolved emotions that lingered like shadows. Yet, in this moment, none of that seemed important. All that mattered now was his pain and the realization that, despite everything, they still shared a bond that couldn't be ignored. "I'm here," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "For Kelly. For you." David let out a soft sigh. "I don't deserve your kindness. I know that. I made a mess of things. All those years ago. And I don't expect you to forgive me." Eleanor took a step closer, her gaze softening. She had spent years processing their past, the arguments, the betrayal, the reasons they had grown apart. And while there was still a part of her that was angry, part of her that was hurt, she realized in this moment that holding on to that anger wouldn't help anyone. Not her, not David, not Kelly. "I'm not here to forgive you or to hold anything over your head, David," she said, her voice quiet. "I'm here because you're family. And family doesn't just walk away when things get tough. It's complicated, I know, but right now, we need to be here for Kelly." David's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in years, he seemed vulnerable in a way Eleanor had never seen. "I never wanted to hurt her, you know? I always wanted the best for her, but I made so many mistakes." Eleanor reached out and placed a hand on his. It was an act of compassion, one she didn't know if she had ever offered to him before. "I know you did. We both made mistakes. But now it's about making sure Kelly isn't alone in all of this." David nodded, swallowing hard. "You're right. She's been through so much. I don't know what to do anymore. I feel so powerless." Eleanor squeezed his hand, her voice gentle but firm. "It's okay to feel powerless sometimes, but it's also important to ask for help. You're not alone in this, David." They sat there in silence for a while, Kelly sitting at the edge of the bed, her eyes red and swollen from the tears she had fought to hold back. Eleanor knew the weight of the situation wasn't going to disappear overnight. But this was a start, a moment of clarity in a time of uncertainty. As they spoke more, David's condition seemed to stabilize, but Eleanor knew this wasn't just a physical healing. This was a moment for emotional healing, for the first time in many years. The years of resentment and anger that had built up between her and David hadn't disappeared. But this moment, the act of showing up, of offering care and support despite everything, was a powerful thing. She realized that forgiveness didn't have to come all at once. Sometimes it came in small, quiet steps. As Eleanor and Kelly left the hospital later that evening, the weight of the day's events settled over them like a heavy blanket. Eleanor's heart was full of mixed emotions, compassion, exhaustion, and a quiet realization that life was unpredictable. Sometimes, the people we least expect need us the most. And sometimes, showing up for them is the hardest, yet most important, thing we can do. "Thanks for being here, Mom," Kelly said, her voice soft but grateful. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Eleanor smiled, squeezing her daughter's hand. "That's what family's for. We don't always know what the right thing is to do, but we do what we can." As they walked out into the cool evening air, Eleanor couldn't help but reflect on the lesson she had learned that day. The strength of family wasn't in perfection or the absence of conflict. It was in showing up when it mattered most, in offering kindness even when it seemed hard, and in accepting that sometimes the most difficult journeys led to the most profound healing. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to show up for someone who hurt you in the past? How did you handle it, and what did you learn from the experience? Share your story with us in the comments below. It had been several weeks since Eleanor's visit to the hospital, and though things between her and David had remained amicable, there was still an unspoken distance. She had seen him a few more times, always at Kelly's request, but the awkwardness between them lingered like a shadow. The days passed in their usual rhythm. Eleanor visiting the park to meet Tom, talking with Jake about his journey to reconcile with Sarah, and still carrying the quiet weight of her own past with David. But something felt different. A change was in the air, though Eleanor couldn't quite name it yet. One bright Saturday morning, as she sat on her porch with a cup of tea, she noticed a familiar face walking down the street toward her. Tom. "Morning, Eleanor," he called, waving as he approached. "Morning, Tom." Eleanor replied with a smile, setting her cup down. "What brings you by today?" Tom grinned, his usual warmth evident. "I was hoping to talk to you about something. Got a minute?" Eleanor nodded, gesturing to the seat beside her. "Of course. You know where the coffee is, if you'd like a cup." Tom chuckled and settled into the chair. "Thanks, but no coffee for me this morning. I've got something on my mind that I think you might want to hear." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "All right, spill it. What's going on?" Tom leaned forward, his expression serious now. "I've been thinking a lot about things lately, about my family, about my past. And, well, I think it's time for me to make amends with someone." Eleanor's curiosity piqued. "Who?" Tom hesitated for a moment before replying. "My daughter, Casey." Eleanor blinked in surprise. Tom had never mentioned much about his daughter before, and she couldn't help but wonder what had brought this on now. "I didn't even know you had a daughter," she said gently. Tom's face softened as he spoke. "I don't talk about her much, but she's in her 20s now. We've been estranged for years. It wasn't always easy, but I think I failed her in a lot of ways, Eleanor. I wasn't the father she needed me to be. And now, I think it's time to try to fix things." Eleanor sat quietly for a moment, letting his words sink in. It was a familiar story. Someone with a broken relationship, someone wanting to make things right. She had heard it in Jake's voice, in David's apology, and now in Tom's. "I can see how important this is to you, Tom," Eleanor said finally, her voice full of understanding. "What happened between you two? If you're comfortable telling me." Tom took a deep breath, his hands resting on his knees. "I wasn't there for her when she needed me. I was too wrapped up in my own life, my own struggles. I didn't listen when she tried to reach out, and I didn't support her when she needed it the most. We both said things we didn't mean, and before I knew it, the distance between us had grown too wide to cross. I thought maybe time would fix things, but it hasn't." Eleanor nodded, knowing all too well the weight of those words. "It's never just about time, though, is it? Sometimes, you have to take the first step yourself." Tom met her eyes, and there was a vulnerability there that she hadn't seen before. "I think you're right. I've been waiting for her to come to me, but I need to be the one to make the first move. I'm just afraid, Eleanor. What if she doesn't want to hear it? What if it's too late?" Eleanor placed a hand on his arm, offering a steadying presence. "It's never too late to try, but you have to be prepared that it might not go the way you hope. She may be angry, hurt, or just not ready to forgive you. But the important thing is that you show her you're willing to be there, no matter what." Tom looked down, his brow furrowing in thought. "I've been thinking about reaching out to her, but I don't know what to say. What if I say the wrong thing?" Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. "Start with honesty. Start by saying you're sorry. Sometimes the best thing you can do is acknowledge your mistakes. People can feel when you're being genuine, Tom. If you approach her with that, you'll be showing her that you care. That's all you can do." Tom sat back in his chair, his mind clearly working over the advice she had given. "I don't even know where to start," he said quietly, almost to himself. Eleanor gave him a thoughtful look. "What was the last thing you said to her? If you could take that back, what would you say?" Tom's face contorted in pain as he thought about it. "I told her she was being selfish. I was angry because she wanted to go to college far away, and I didn't want her to leave. I wanted her to stay here, to stay close to me. I couldn't let go. But she wasn't being selfish. She was just growing up. I couldn't see that." Eleanor gave him a reassuring smile. "That's a start. You've already identified where things went wrong. Now, you just need to reach out and tell her that. You don't need to have all the answers or the perfect words, Tom. You just need to show up and be real. Tom's expression softened, a sense of resolve starting to form in his eyes. You're right. It's time to stop running from it. Eleanor patted his arm gently. And remember, no matter what happens, you're not alone in this. You've already shown you're willing to try. That's something worth holding on to. The conversation with Tom stayed with Eleanor for the rest of the day. She had known people who had struggled with the idea of reconciliation, but she hadn't fully understood the weight of those struggles until now. The fear of rejection, of not being enough, of the words not being enough. It was a daunting thing to face. But she also knew, deep down, that the power of words, when spoken with honesty and intention, could heal even the deepest wounds. Later that evening, as she sat alone in her living room, Eleanor couldn't help but reflect on her own life. The conversations she had with Jake, the visit to the hospital with David, and now Tom's revelation. The importance of the words we speak, and the weight they carry, had never been so clear to her. It wasn't just about saying the right thing. It was about being vulnerable enough to show up, to speak truthfully, and to accept the consequences of those words. The fear that came with it was natural, but it was also part of the healing process. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real lesson she was learning now. That the courage to speak, to try, and to face the unknown was what truly healed hearts. Have you ever said something to someone that you wish you could take back? How did you handle it? And did you ever get the chance to make things right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. It had been a few days since Tom's conversation with Eleanor, and he was still wrestling with the decision to reach out to his daughter, Casey. The quiet comfort of Eleanor's advice echoed in his mind, but the fear of rejection kept him paralyzed, stuck in a loop of what-ifs. What if she didn't want to hear from him? What if his words weren't enough? Despite the uncertainty, Tom knew he couldn't avoid it any longer. He had spent so many years carrying the weight of his mistakes, but he realized that if he didn't at least try to make things right, he would carry the burden for the rest of his life. That morning, as he sat at the kitchen table sipping coffee, he found himself staring at his phone, his thumb hovering over her number. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The same number he hadn't dialed in over 5 years. The same number that had once been the bridge to his daughter's life, now a lifeline he was too afraid to grasp. Tom exhaled sharply and pressed call. Casey had been living in a small apartment downtown, away from the small town where she grew up. She'd moved there after graduating from college, wanting to start fresh, far from the memories of her fractured family. When her phone rang that morning, she didn't recognize the number, but something inside her told her to pick up. "Hello?" she answered, her voice cautious, but polite. There was a long pause on the other end. "Casey?" Her heart skipped a beat. The voice was familiar, but she hadn't heard it in so long. Her father. She hadn't seen him since the fight that tore their relationship apart all those years ago. She had built walls around herself to protect her heart, convinced that the distance between them was for the best. "Yeah, it's me," she replied, trying to keep the shakiness out of her voice. I didn't know if you'd pick up," Tom said, his words slow and unsure. "But I need to talk to you." Casey's chest tightened. This was the last thing she had expected today. She had spent so many years processing the pain of their last conversation, the words they had exchanged, the rejection she had felt. It felt like a lifetime ago, but those scars didn't fade easily. "What do you want, Dad?" she asked, her voice colder than she intended. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this, but at the same time, something inside her longed to know why he was calling now, after all these years. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Casey," Tom began, his voice full of emotion. "I don't even know where to begin, but I've been thinking a lot about everything, and I realized something. I owe you an apology. For everything." Casey felt the sting of his words. She had spent so many years justifying his absence, convincing herself that he didn't care, that he wasn't worth the emotional effort. But hearing him say those words, admitting that he had failed her, caught her off guard. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You left me when I needed you the most. You didn't even try to be there for me. How am I supposed to just let that go?" There was a long pause before Tom spoke again. I understand. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, or ever, maybe, but I want you to know that I regret it. Every day. I should have been there, Casey. I should have fought for you when you needed me. I was selfish and I was wrong. Casey closed her eyes, the flood of emotions rushing back. Anger, hurt, frustration. But there was something else, something deeper. A part of her wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was being honest. The hurt was still there, but it was no longer enough to completely shut him out. I don't even know who you are anymore, Dad, she whispered, her voice softening. You were never the father I needed. I know, Tom responded, the weight of his words hanging between them. I can't change the past, but I want to be better now. If you'll let me, I want to try to be part of your life again. Not to fix things, but to be there for you. However, you need me to be. For a long time, Casey said nothing. The silence between them was deafening. She had so many questions, so many feelings she hadn't been able to process over the years. Could she really allow him back in? Was she ready to face the possibility that people could change? I don't know if I'm ready for that, she said finally, her voice filled with uncertainty. But I hear you. I hear what you're saying. And that's more than you've ever said before. Tom let out a deep breath, a mixture of relief and anxiety. I understand. And if that's all I get from you, I'll take it. Just know I'm here, whenever you're ready. No pressure. Casey bit her lip, her fingers gripping the phone. She didn't know what the future held for their relationship, but something had shifted in her. The wall she had built over the years had cracks now. Tiny cracks, but cracks nonetheless. I'm not saying I forgive you, but maybe we can start with being civil, she said quietly. I don't know where this is going, but I'm willing to try, in my own time. Tom's voice broke with emotion. That's all I can ask for, Casey. Thank you. They ended the call with a tentative goodbye, neither one sure what the future would hold. But for the first time in years, both felt a glimmer of hope, a small flicker that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Later that day, Eleanor received a message from Tom. I did it, it read simply. I called her. I apologized. I don't know what will happen next, but I feel like I did the right thing. Eleanor smiled as she read the message, her heart swelling with pride. It wasn't the perfect resolution. There were still so many things left unsaid, so many scars that needed healing, but it was a step. And that, Eleanor knew, was the most important thing. Sometimes, all it took was the courage to take the first step, even when the path ahead was uncertain. She sat back in her chair, reflecting on the courage it had taken for Tom to make that call. It was a lesson she had learned too, in her own way, with David. Healing didn't always happen overnight. It wasn't always about the perfect words or the perfect timing. It was about showing up, speaking truth, and allowing room for growth on both sides. As the sun set over the horizon, Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her own journey. She had learned so much in the past few months, from her own struggles to those of the people around her. And she knew one thing for certain. Healing was possible, no matter how broken the past had been. Have you ever had a difficult conversation with someone you were estranged from? What did you say, and how did it feel afterward? Share your experience with us in the comments below. It had been a week since Tom's phone call to Casey. Though neither of them had spoken again since that conversation, there was a strange sense of relief in the air. Tom spent his days waiting, reflecting, and hoping. He knew it would take time for the dust to settle, but the simple fact that he had reached out, and that Casey had listened, gave him a small sense of peace. Eleanor, on the other hand, had been busy with her own life, but she hadn't forgotten about Tom's breakthrough. She had seen him around town a few times since their conversation, and she could tell that something had shifted. He seemed lighter, more at ease, even though the future with Casey was still uncertain. Eleanor wasn't the type to pry, but she felt a sense of duty to check in on him. She had walked this road of reconciliation herself and knew how hard it could be, even with the smallest steps. That morning, after finishing her breakfast, she grabbed her phone and texted Tom, "How are you doing? Any updates?" A few minutes later, his reply came through. "Still waiting. But I feel better, Eleanor. I think she's thinking about it. Maybe that's all I can ask for right now." Eleanor smiled to herself. That was progress. It wasn't the quick fix they all hoped for, but it was something. And in her experience, sometimes waiting was the hardest part. Meanwhile, across town, Jake was in the middle of his own internal conflict. He had spent the last few weeks reconnecting with his estranged wife, Sarah, and their relationship was slowly starting to heal. They'd had some tough conversations, but they were making progress. The emotional distance between them was still there, but it was shrinking, and they were finding their way back to each other, piece by piece. Jake sat in his office, staring at the email from his lawyer. It was about the final paperwork for the divorce, a decision he had never fully accepted. Though he had moved on from the bitterness that had clouded his mind when they first separated, signing those papers felt like a final cut. He hadn't realized how hard it would be to let go, especially when there was still so much unresolved between them. His phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. He picked it up to find a message from Sarah. "I've been thinking about us, and I'd like to talk. Can we meet tonight?" Jake's heart raced a little at the thought. It had been a while since she had reached out in such a direct way. He wasn't sure what the conversation would entail, but he knew one thing. It was a sign of progress. She wanted to work through the pain, just like he did. "I'll be there," Jake replied, feeling a mixture of anticipation and fear. This was another step toward healing. But would it be the final one? As the evening approached, Tom found himself sitting in the same park bench where he and Eleanor had talked about Casey just a week ago. He had come here to think, to clear his head, but his mind kept wandering back to the phone call. There was something stirring within him, a feeling of hope that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He gazed at the children playing in the distance, their laughter echoing in the air, a stark contrast to the weight of his own thoughts. The innocence of their joy reminded him of the things he had taken for granted when his daughter was younger, the years he had wasted on pride and stubbornness. He missed her, more than words could express. He missed the little girl who had once clung to him for comfort, and the teenager who had pushed him away in search of independence. Tom's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he quickly pulled it out, hoping it was a message from Casey. He opened it, only to find a simple text from Eleanor. "I'm proud of you for reaching out to her. You've done something brave." His chest tightened, and he felt a mix of gratitude and guilt. He hadn't done enough yet, not by a long shot, but it was a start, and that had to count for something. That night, Jake and Sarah sat across from each other in the small cafe where they used to frequent. It was a place full of memories, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, it was a place of potential, a chance to rewrite their story. "I don't know where to start," Sarah said, her voice tentative. Jake smiled softly. "Start with the truth. That's all we can do." Sarah took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. The mistakes, the things we said to each other. I'm not proud of how things ended. I know we both hurt each other, but I've realized something, Jake. I've been holding on to the past, but maybe it's time to let go. Not just of you, but of the resentment I've been carrying." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had heard those words in therapy, but hearing them from Sarah, the woman he had once promised forever, felt like a weight being lifted off his shoulders. He had been holding on to his own anger, his own pain, for so long, thinking it was the only thing that protected him. "I've been holding on too," Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought if I just kept fighting it, it would make things better, but it's only made it worse." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand, a quiet gesture of reconciliation. "I don't know what the future holds for us, Jake, but I do know that I'm ready to stop fighting. I'm ready to face whatever comes next, together." Tears welled up in Jake's eyes as he squeezed her hand. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what would happen in the coming weeks or months. But in that moment, he realized that sometimes the best thing you can do is to stop fighting and start healing. The next morning, Eleanor sat in her favorite chair, watching the sun rise over the horizon. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions, of healing, and of change. But one thing had become clearer than ever. The ripple effect of one small act of courage had the power to change everything. She thought of Tom, waiting for news from Casey, and of Jake and Sarah, taking tentative steps toward forgiveness. She thought of herself, finally making peace with her past. Every step forward was a small victory, and every conversation held the possibility of something more. She knew that the journey was far from over, that there would be more pain, more challenges ahead. But she also knew that sometimes, the only thing you could do was show up and try. And that, she thought with a soft smile, was enough. Have you ever experienced a moment of reconciliation after years of silence? What did it feel like to reconnect with someone from your past? Share your story in the comments below. The weeks that followed the dinner with Sarah were a turning point for Jake. As much as he wished things could go back to the way they were, he knew that wasn't possible. His conversations with Sarah had stirred up a lot of raw emotions, guilt, regret, but also a renewed sense of hope. Still, neither of them knew exactly what the future would hold. They had been through too much to pretend that everything could be fixed with a few heart-to-heart talks. Jake found himself back at the same cafe a few days later, sitting alone at a table by the window. He was lost in thought when he heard a familiar voice. He looked up to see his old friend, Mike, walking toward him. Mike had been his best friend for years before life, especially his troubled marriage, had gotten in the way of their relationship. "Mind if I sit?" Mike asked, grinning as he pulled out a chair. "Of course not," Jake said, trying to smile. "It's good to see you, Mike. Been a while, huh?" Mike sat down and gave a small laugh. "A while? It's been years, man. Years. I heard about you and Sarah. You guys getting back in touch. That's good, right?" Jake shrugged, feeling the weight of the conversation. "I don't know. It's complicated. But yeah, it feels like we're making progress." Mike nodded, his expression serious. "I get it. Sometimes, things don't just snap back into place. Takes time. But Jake, I have to ask, have you figured out what you want yet? Not just what Sarah wants, or what you think you should want, but what you need." Jake stared at his coffee, unsure how to answer. He had been so focused on fixing the damage with Sarah that he hadn't truly stopped to consider his own needs. For years, he had put aside his own happiness, assuming that if he could just keep things together, everything would work itself out. But now, with Sarah opening up and the possibility of reconciliation on the horizon, Jake felt as though he was standing at a crossroads. "I'm not sure," Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I'm just afraid of losing everything again. I don't want to go through that pain again." Mike leaned forward, his tone softer. "You're not the only one who feels that way, buddy. You can't make decisions based on fear, though. You've got to decide what's best for you, not just for Sarah or anyone else. You can't keep trying to fix everything without fixing yourself first." Jake considered Mike's words, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of clarity. He had been so focused on salvaging the relationship with Sarah that he hadn't thought about his own well-being. Was this truly what he wanted? Or had he been too afraid to let go of something that had been broken for a long time? Across town, Eleanor sat on her porch, sipping her morning tea. The air was crisp, and the sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft glow across the landscape. She had been reflecting on her own journey of healing. Her divorce from David, the struggle she had faced raising her children, and the reconciliation she had found with Tom and even David. All of it had taught her one thing. Healing wasn't a linear process. It didn't come with a timetable, and there were no guarantees. Eleanor had been in touch with Tom a few times since his call to Casey, and she knew he was still waiting. His hope for reconciliation with his daughter had not wavered, but it was clear that he was still in a holding pattern. She had watched him struggle with his past decisions, but now there was a new light in his eyes, an openness to whatever the future held, no matter how uncertain it seemed. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Tom. "Hey, Tom. What's going on?" she asked, sensing the urgency in his voice. "I did it again," Tom replied, his voice filled with both excitement and fear. "I called Casey. This time, I told her that I was going to be patient, that I'd give her space, but I was never going to stop trying. She didn't say much, but I think she's starting to soften. At least I hope so." Eleanor smiled warmly, but her heart ached for him. She knew how hard it was to be vulnerable, to put yourself out there with no guarantee of the outcome. "You're doing the right thing, Tom. It's all about showing up, and you're doing that. Just keep being patient. This will take time." Tom paused, his breath shaky. "I don't know if I can keep doing this." What if she doesn't want me in her life? What if I'm too late? Eleanor took a deep breath, thinking of her own experiences with estranged loved ones. She understood his fears, but she also knew the power of persistence and love. "You're not too late," Eleanor said softly. "You're never too late. Love doesn't have deadlines. You just have to keep showing up, and sometimes that's enough. You've already taken the hardest step." The next day, Sarah reached out to Jake again, this time suggesting they take a weekend trip to clear their minds. She wanted to talk, not just about their relationship, but about everything they had been through. The idea of a getaway felt like the right move for both of them, away from the pressures of everyday life, where they could focus on themselves without distractions. They drove out to the countryside, a place they had visited many years ago before the divorce. The familiarity of the place seemed to ease the tension between them, and as they sat on a bench overlooking a quiet lake, Sarah opened up in a way she hadn't in a long time. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sarah began, her voice calm but filled with emotion, "about holding on to resentment. It's been eating at me for so long, but I've realized that it's only been hurting me. Not you, not anyone else, just me. I think I've been afraid to let go because I thought it would mean that I was letting go of what we had, and I didn't want to do that." Jake listened quietly, his heart softening as he realized the weight Sarah had been carrying. It was a weight he, too, had been carrying, but now they both understood it was time to set it down. "I feel the same way," Jake said, his voice steady. "I've been scared too, but maybe letting go doesn't mean giving up. Maybe it's the only way to move forward, together or apart. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that I'm willing to try. If you are." Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm willing to try. No matter what happens, I don't want to live with this hurt anymore." The two of them sat in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon, both feeling a sense of peace that had eluded them for so long. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning. Back at home, Tom received a message from Casey. It was brief, just a "thank you for reaching out," followed by a smiley face emoji. It wasn't a grand gesture, but for Tom, it was a sign. He had taken a step forward. He had shown his daughter he was ready to be a part of her life, and now it was up to her to decide how to respond. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but as he looked at the message, he realized that sometimes the most important thing wasn't the outcome. It was the willingness to try. Have you ever found yourself holding on to resentment in a relationship? What did it take for you to let go and move forward? Share your thoughts or experiences with us in the comments below. The weekend away had given Jake and Sarah some much-needed space to talk, reflect, and grow. But as they returned to their everyday lives, the real work of mending their broken relationship began. The lingering doubts and fears that had crept into their minds during their years apart still hovered, threatening to undo the progress they had made. Back home, Sarah spent the first few days processing the conversations they'd had during their trip. It was clear to her that Jake had changed in some ways, but there were still aspects of their old dynamic that felt too familiar, too broken. The cracks they tried to patch over were still visible. One afternoon, Sarah found herself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. She had been going through old photos of her and Jake. Happy moments, vacations, celebrations, but it only made her heart ache. It was hard to reconcile the joyful memories with the pain that had followed. She knew that part of her still loved him, but was that enough? Was love enough to rebuild something that had been so fractured? As Sarah sat there, lost in thought, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her friend. "Mia, you doing okay? I know things with Jake have been complicated. Just wanted to check in." Sarah sighed, feeling both grateful and overwhelmed. She had always been able to rely on Mia for support, but now, even her closest friends didn't fully understand what she was going through. Could anyone? Really? "I'm fine. Just trying to figure things out." The response came almost immediately. "Sarah, you've been through a lot. You deserve someone who knows how to love you properly, not someone who keeps you stuck in the past." Sarah stared at the message. It hit her harder than she expected. She had spent so much time trying to fix her past with Jake that she had lost sight of the future. Her future. She wanted to believe that love could heal all wounds, but was it enough to heal what had been shattered for so long? Meanwhile, Jake had been wrestling with his own set of doubts. Since their return, he couldn't help but notice the distance growing between him and Sarah. They were cordial, but there was no warmth, no spark like there had been before. It felt like they were two strangers, sharing a house but not a life. Jake spent his evenings working late, trying to keep his mind occupied, but it wasn't working. Every night, his thoughts turned back to Sarah. How could they possibly move forward when they were both still so stuck in the past? It felt like every step they took forward was met with another step back. Then, one evening, Jake received a call that would change everything. It was from his brother, Matt. They hadn't spoken much in recent months, mostly due to the distance that had grown between them over the years. But tonight, Matt had something important to say. "Hey, Jake," Matt said, his voice serious. "I think we need to talk. I've been thinking a lot about our family, about everything that's happened. I don't want to wait until it's too late." Jake felt a lump form in his throat. There had been so many things unsaid between him and Matt, and now it seemed like they were finally coming to a head. "Yeah, I've been thinking the same thing," Jake replied, his voice low. "It feels like I've been running from everything, you know? But I don't want to keep doing that." Matt sighed on the other end. "I get it. But you're not just running from the past, Jake. You're running from yourself. And you've got to stop before you lose everything." Jake didn't know how to respond. His brother's words hit him hard, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had to confront the truth. Not just about Sarah or their relationship, but about himself. Later that night, after a long conversation with Matt, Jake sat on the edge of the bed, deep in thought. Sarah had already gone to bed, and the house was eerily quiet. He couldn't ignore the overwhelming sense of guilt that consumed him. He had spent so much of his life trying to do the right thing, but somewhere along the way, he had lost track of what truly mattered. As he lay there, staring at the ceiling, Jake thought about his daughter, Lily. He hadn't spoken to her in months, and the guilt over their estrangement weighed heavily on him. Was he doing the same thing with Sarah? Running from the pain instead of facing it head-on? He stood up abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. Grabbing his jacket, Jake walked out the door and into the night. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he knew he needed to clear his mind. As he walked through the quiet streets, the weight of his decisions hung over him. Could he fix the damage he had caused? Could he be the man Sarah needed him to be? The next day, Sarah woke up to an empty house. Jake had left early, without saying goodbye, and for a moment, panic set in. Was this it? Had he given up on them already? But as the day went on, Sarah realized something important. She had been living in a state of fear for so long, afraid to confront her own feelings and afraid to move forward. She had spent too many years waiting for Jake to change, for things to get better, and it was time for her to take control of her own future. No one was going to do it for her. After much thought, Sarah called Mia back. "I think I'm finally ready to let go of the past," she said quietly. "Not just with Jake, but with everything. I can't keep living in this cycle of fear and regret." Mia's voice was filled with encouragement. "I'm proud of you, Sarah. Sometimes, the hardest thing is letting go, but it's also the most freeing." That evening, Jake returned home, but something was different. The tension between him and Sarah was still there, but it wasn't as suffocating as it had been. They sat down at the kitchen table, their eyes meeting for the first time in what felt like weeks. "I've been thinking," Jake began, his voice low. "I've been running from so many things, my past, my mistakes, my fears. But I can't keep doing that. I need to face it all, with you, or without you." Sarah looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I've been thinking too," she replied softly, "and I'm done living in fear. I need to stop waiting for things to fix themselves. I have to take control of my own life." They both sat in silence, the weight of their words hanging between them. It wasn't the resolution they had hoped for, but it was a step forward. For the first time in a long time, they both realized that healing was not about fixing the past. It was about finding the courage to move forward, no matter how uncertain the future seemed. Have you ever had to face your fears and confront the past in order to move forward? What steps did you take to reclaim your life and your peace of mind? Share your story with us in the comments below. Jake's decision to face his fears and Sarah's determination to take control of her own future had opened a new chapter in their lives. However, even with their newfound resolve, the weight of their shared history continued to linger. There was still much work to be done, not just between them, but also within themselves. Neither of them knew what the next step would look like, but they had agreed that they would try to rebuild, try to heal, try to move forward. But life, as always, had a way of throwing surprises their way. A few weeks after their heart-to-heart, Jake received an unexpected phone call. He was at work, his mind already filled with the many deadlines ahead of him when the call came through. It was from his daughter, Lily. He hadn't heard from her in months, and he had been too proud, too scared, to reach out. But now, here she was calling him. "Hey, Dad." Lily's voice was soft but steady, and it almost took Jake by surprise. It had been so long since they'd talked. "I was thinking about you. And I know we haven't been close lately, but I need to ask you something." Jake's heart pounded. "Of course, sweetheart. What's going on?" There was a long pause before Lily spoke again. "I'm getting married." The words hit Jake like a wave crashing onto the shore. He had always hoped that one day, Lily would find happiness and stability, but hearing that she was getting married felt surreal, almost like a dream. So much had happened in their relationship that he never thought they'd get to this point. That's great news," Jake managed to say, his voice trembling despite his attempt to remain calm. "Who's the lucky guy?" Her voice softened. "His name is Ethan. I really care about him, Dad, and I just wanted you to know before anyone else." A smile crept onto Jake's face as he realized how much he had missed in his daughter's life. All the moments he had missed, her first boyfriend, her high school graduation, and now her wedding. The realization stung, and guilt crept into his chest, but there was also a deep sense of pride. Lily was growing into the woman she was meant to be, with or without him. But he knew now that he had to make things right. "When is it?" "The wedding, I mean," Jake asked, struggling to keep his voice even. "Next month," Lily replied. "I want you to be there, Dad. I know things haven't been great, but I really want you there." The invitation was a lifeline, a chance for Jake to begin rebuilding his relationship with his daughter. He knew he couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could show her that he was still trying. "I'll be there, Lily. I promise," he said, his voice firm. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Meanwhile, Sarah had been dealing with her own emotional hurdles. She had been working hard to move on from the past, but sometimes the shadows of what had been still crept into her thoughts. She was doing her best to focus on herself, on her own dreams, on her own goals, but a nagging feeling remained. One evening, as she was finishing a long day of work, Sarah received a text from her best friend, Mia. "I know you've been focusing on yourself, but how are you really doing with everything? With Jake? With Lily's wedding coming up? It's okay if it's still tough." Sarah stared at the text for a moment before typing back. "It's tough. I won't lie about that. But I'm doing okay. I think I'm starting to understand that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting. It just means learning how to live with the past and not letting it control me." Mia replied almost instantly. "You've come so far, Sarah. But don't forget, you don't have to do this alone. You've got people who love you, including me." Sarah smiled at the words. Mia had always been there for her, and now, as Sarah found herself at a crossroads, her friend's support meant more than ever. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Jake threw himself into preparing for Lily's wedding, making the necessary arrangements to be there and hoping that this could be the turning point in his relationship with her. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He had a lot to make up for, but he also knew that it was a start. A small but significant step. He also spent more time with Sarah, but the tension between them was undeniable. It wasn't that they didn't care for each other. It was that they were still figuring out who they were together, if they were to be together at all. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same questions. What did they want? What were they willing to fight for? Did they have a future together? Or was it time to let go? Jake found himself asking those same questions every night as he lay in bed, unable to sleep. He wanted to be the man Sarah deserved, but did he have enough time to prove it? Did she still want him in her life? Or was their love story already over? The week before Lily's wedding, Jake made a decision. He knew he couldn't show up to the ceremony without clearing the air with Sarah first. He needed to talk to her, to be honest about where he stood, not just with her, but with himself. One evening, after dinner, Jake sat down with Sarah. They were both tired, but there was a heaviness in the air that neither could ignore. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," Jake began, his voice tentative. "Lily invited me to her wedding next month. And I need to go. I know I've made a mess of things with her, but this is important. I can't keep running from my past." Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes not meeting his. "I understand, Jake. I'm glad you're going. Lily deserves that, and so do you." There was a pause before Jake spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I don't want to lose you, Sarah. I don't want to lose us, if there's still an us to have. But I also know that I have to do this, for me. I have to be the father she needs, whether or not that means we're okay." The words hung in the air like a delicate thread, neither fully mended nor completely torn. But for the first time in a long while, it felt like there was a chance, an opening for something new. "I want you to go," Sarah said after a long silence. "You're her father. You deserve to be there. And I deserve to figure out what I want, too." The air between them lightened, but the future still felt uncertain. Have you ever had to face your past to move forward? What steps did you take to rebuild relationships that seemed broken? We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Share them with us below. The days leading up to Lily's wedding were a whirlwind of activity for both Jake and Sarah. For Jake, the wedding was a chance to redeem himself in the eyes of his daughter. For Sarah, it was a quiet moment of reflection, one that left her thinking deeply about her own future and the changes she had been making in her life. The wedding was taking place in a beautiful venue nestled in the hills outside the city. A charming vineyard surrounded by rows of grapes and dotted with twinkling lights. It was the kind of place that seemed to hold 1,000 dreams within its lush grounds. The kind of place where people were meant to start new chapters in their lives. As Jake prepared for the wedding, he felt a combination of excitement and nerves. He hadn't seen Lily in so long, and even though they had spoken on the phone, the emotional distance between them was still palpable. It had been years since they had been close, and now, as he walked toward the vineyard on the morning of the wedding, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. What if Lily didn't want him there? What if she hadn't truly forgiven him for all the years of neglect? But there was no turning back. This was his chance to show her that he was committed to being part of her life again. Sarah, on the other hand, was also grappling with her own emotions as the wedding day approached. While she had no personal attachment to the event, she had been involved in helping Jake prepare for it, even offering to pick up a few things for him as he worked on the logistical side. It wasn't easy. Seeing Jake so focused on his daughter made Sarah realize how much she had hoped, deep down, that they could have been a family again. But she knew that they were both on separate paths, and while their shared history would always bind them, their future together was uncertain. That morning, as Sarah walked into the kitchen to make herself a cup of coffee, she noticed the wedding invitation sitting on the counter. She hadn't yet decided whether she would attend, unsure of her place in the situation. Jake was going, but did she need to go too? She didn't want to make things awkward, especially if Jake and Lily were still working through their own issues. After a few moments of contemplation, Sarah decided that she didn't need to go. This day was about Jake and Lily, and she had to respect that. She could offer her support from a distance. The ceremony began in the late afternoon, the sun dipping low behind the hills as guests gathered beneath the archway of flowers. Jake arrived early, feeling the familiar pangs of anxiety creeping into his chest. He walked over to the area where the family was seated, trying to find a comfortable spot. But it wasn't long before he saw her, Lily, walking down the aisle in her white gown, a radiant smile on her face. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt his heart swell with pride. She looked so much like her mother in that moment, beautiful, confident, and ready to start her own journey. And despite all the mistakes he had made, she had invited him to share this moment with her. That, in itself, was a gift he wasn't going to take for granted. Lily's eyes found his in the crowd, and she gave him a small, knowing smile. Jake's chest tightened as he stood up to take his place. This was the moment he had been waiting for. For forgiveness, for a fresh start, for a chance to be the father she needed. As the ceremony progressed, Sarah sat quietly at home, watching from a distance. She had decided not to attend, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of bittersweet pride for Jake. He was doing it. He was showing up, and for once, it seemed like he was truly trying. But even as she cheered him on from afar, she knew she had to focus on her own healing. She couldn't keep holding on to the past, no matter how much she still cared about him. It wasn't long before Sarah received a text from Mia. "How's everything going? Are you sure you're okay with not going to the wedding?" Sarah paused, staring at the message. She had been questioning her decision all day, wondering if she should have just shown up and supported Jake. But at the same time, she knew she had to put herself first. She couldn't be the safety net anymore, not until she was sure of her own path. "I'm fine. I think I made the right choice," Sarah replied, her fingers hovering over the screen as she thought about the words. "I need to let him go, Mia. I need to be okay on my own." The reply was quick. "You're stronger than you realize, Sarah. You'll figure this out." Back at the vineyard, the reception was in full swing. The air was filled with laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses. Guests mingled beneath the twinkling lights as Lily and Ethan shared their first dance. Jake stood off to the side, watching his daughter and her new husband, a contented smile on his face. He had promised himself that he would be present for this moment, no matter the personal cost. After a while, Lily made her way over to Jake. He stood up, surprised at how easily they slipped back into an easy conversation, just like old times. "I'm really glad you came, Dad," Lily said, her eyes sparkling. "It means a lot to me. It's been a long time, but I think we're finally getting there, don't you think?" Jake's voice cracked slightly as he nodded. "I hope so, Lily. I really do. I've missed you. I know I've made a lot of mistakes, but I'll keep trying to be the father you deserve." Lily squeezed his hand. "I know you will, and that's all I need." Jake felt a lump in his throat, a mixture of relief and guilt. He hadn't been the father he had wanted to be, but he was here now, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like it might just be enough. Back at home, Sarah sat quietly, reflecting on the day. As she sipped her tea, she realized something. She didn't need to be at the wedding to find closure. She didn't need to hold on to the past to create a future. And for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle in her heart. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know what the future held for her and Jake. But she knew that she was ready to let go of the need to fix everything. She was ready to move forward, on her own terms. Have you ever had to let go of someone or something to move forward in your life? How did you find the strength to let go and embrace your own path? Share your thoughts with us below. The wedding was over, and life was slowly returning to its rhythm. The days that followed were filled with a quiet sense of introspection. For Jake, the relief of having made it through the wedding without any major emotional setbacks gave him a new sense of purpose. He had kept his promise to Lily. He had shown up. They had shared a few moments, small but meaningful, and it had felt like the beginning of something new. But even with this newfound hope, Jake knew that there was still much to do. Rebuilding a relationship with his daughter after all these years wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. It would take time to understand each other again, to trust each other again, and to face the years of unspoken hurt. For Sarah, the wedding had been a turning point too. Though she had made the choice not to attend, the decision had helped her realize something important. She didn't need to rely on Jake's actions to validate her own worth. She had spent so long looking to him for closure, for some sort of sign that their relationship could still work, but now she was beginning to see that closure had to come from within her. It wasn't about waiting for Jake to change or hoping that things would magically fall into place. It was about her deciding that she was ready to move forward, no matter what. As the days passed, Sarah focused on herself more than ever. She began to immerse herself in her career, setting new goals and pushing herself to achieve things she had always put on the back burner. She started taking yoga classes again, something she had loved but abandoned when life had become too chaotic. She felt a sense of peace with the decision she had made, and with each new step, she felt herself growing stronger. Meanwhile, Jake was doing his best to reconnect with Lily, and it wasn't always easy. He knew that his absence over the years had left a scar, and while their interactions were warm, there were moments when the silence between them felt thick, unspoken words lingering in the air. One afternoon, Jake invited Lily out for coffee. He wanted to talk, to let her know how much he appreciated her willingness to give him another chance. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Jake began, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "I know I wasn't there when you needed me, and I regret that. I regret not being the father I should have been." Lily smiled softly, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "Dad, I know, and I've forgiven you for that. But it's not about forgetting. It's about moving forward. We can't change the past, but we can still make new memories." Jake nodded, feeling a sense of guilt wash over him. He hadn't been a father to Lily when she needed him the most, and he knew that some of the damage was beyond repair. But hearing her words gave him hope. Perhaps they could still build something from the ashes of the past. Maybe they would never be the perfect father-daughter pair, but they could try. And that was enough for him. "I want to be part of your life again, Lily," Jake said, his voice sincere. "And I'll keep showing up, no matter how long it takes." Lily reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "I know, Dad, and I appreciate that. It's going to take time, but I think we're getting there." Back at home, Sarah had spent a few weeks reflecting on the relationship between her and Jake. She found herself thinking about their past, the good times, the bad times, and the moments in between. But one thing had become clear to her. They had both changed. She had changed. She couldn't keep holding on to the past, to the version of Jake she had once known. She had to accept that their relationship, whatever it had been, was over. And while that was a painful truth to accept, it also came with a sense of liberation. Sarah was finally letting go, truly and completely. It didn't mean she didn't still care about Jake, or that she wanted to erase him from her life. It just meant that she was no longer waiting for something that might never come. One evening, Sarah sat down with her journal, something she had started doing more regularly lately. She wrote down everything that had been on her mind, every feeling she had been holding back. As she wrote, she felt the weight of the past begin to lift, bit by bit. "I am enough," she wrote in the margins of the page, a mantra she had been repeating to herself. "I don't need anyone to define me. I define myself." Later that week, Sarah got an unexpected call. It was from her mother. "Sarah, I've been thinking," her mother's voice came through the phone, hesitant but warm. "I know things have been difficult between us, but I want to tell you how proud I am of you. I see the changes in you, and I think you're finally figuring things out." Sarah felt a lump in her throat. She hadn't expected this kind of affirmation from her mother, not after all the years of strained communication. But hearing her mother say those words felt like a weight being lifted from her shoulders. It was the validation she didn't even know she needed. "Thanks, Mom," Sarah replied softly. "It means a lot to hear you say that." They spoke for a while longer, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a sense of connection with her mother, something she hadn't felt in years. It was another step in her healing, another sign that she was moving in the right direction. Meanwhile, Jake continued his journey of personal growth. He had started attending therapy, something he had been avoiding for years. The process wasn't easy, but it was helping him understand his past, his mistakes, and how to be a better man. Not just for Lily, but for himself. He knew that his work wasn't done, that healing and rebuilding relationships were ongoing processes. But for the first time in a long time, Jake felt hopeful. He wasn't the man he once was, and that felt like a victory. Have you ever experienced the kind of growth that comes from letting go of the past? How did you find the strength to move forward and embrace the future? Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear from you. Weeks passed, and life slowly continued its steady rhythm for Jake and Sarah. The dust from the wedding had settled, but it had left behind a sense of quiet hope, an unspoken promise that things could and would improve, both for them and for the relationships they had worked so hard to rebuild. For Jake, the focus was on proving himself, not just to Lily but to himself. Therapy had become an important part of his life, an unexpected yet essential catalyst for understanding his past mistakes. He had been going regularly, making strides in areas he hadn't even known needed attention. Each session left him feeling a little more whole, a little more at peace with the man he was becoming. Lily's relationship with him was slowly but surely progressing. Their conversations weren't always easy, but there was something beautiful about the shared understanding they had developed in recent weeks. It wasn't about erasing the years of absence. It was about forging a new connection, one built on patience, vulnerability, and respect. Sarah, on the other hand, had spent the last few weeks carving out space for herself. She had immersed herself in her work, taking on more responsibilities, focusing on her projects, and even launching a new initiative at her company. The effort was fulfilling, but it also came with a bittersweet realization. While her career was thriving, she had yet to fully let go of the feelings she still held for Jake. Despite all her self-affirmations, despite all the steps she had taken to move forward, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what could have been. Would things have turned out differently if she hadn't left him all those years ago? What if she had stayed, fought for their love, and tried harder to make their family work? But she knew the truth. The past was gone. Jake was a different man now, and so was she. They both had grown, but in separate directions. The life they once imagined was not meant to be, but that didn't mean either of them couldn't have a meaningful future. It just wasn't going to be together. One evening, as Sarah walked home from work, she passed a small cafe she'd always noticed but had never entered. There was something about the cozy, inviting atmosphere that seemed to call to her. Maybe it was time for a change. She stepped inside, greeted by the warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the soft hum of quiet chatter. The barista, a young woman with a friendly smile, handed her a latte. As Sarah took a seat by the window, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. Maybe it was the peaceful ambience, or maybe it was the realization that she was starting to build a life for herself outside of Jake and their shared history. As she sipped her drink, Sarah found herself thinking about the future. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't consumed with thoughts of what was lost. Instead, she felt a quiet excitement about what was to come, about the possibilities that awaited her. She could build new relationships, new experiences, and explore parts of herself she hadn't yet discovered. The next day, Jake called Sarah. It had been a while since they'd talked, and he knew this was an important conversation to have. He had been thinking a lot about their past, their present, and the future, and he wanted to make sure they were both on the same page. "Sarah, I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," Jake said when she answered the phone. "I know we've been through a lot, but I want you to know that I'm really trying to do better. Not just for Lily, but for me too." Sarah paused for a moment. The sound of his voice still stirred something inside her, but she had learned to be more honest with herself. "I can hear that, Jake," she replied, her voice steady but gentle. "And I'm glad you're finding peace with yourself. You deserve it. But I've realized something too. We've both changed. I've changed. And I don't know if we can ever go back to what we were. But that doesn't mean we can't be okay, or even be friends." Jake's heart clenched slightly. He had known this conversation was coming, but hearing Sarah say it out loud still stung. "I get it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry for everything, Sarah. I really am. But I respect your decision." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, neither of them knew what to say. Then Sarah spoke again, her voice soft but resolute. "I know you're trying, Jake. I know you're a different person now, and maybe that's all we can ask for. But we've both been through too much to expect something from each other that's not possible anymore." Jake nodded, though she couldn't see it. "I understand, and I'm glad you're finding your own path. You deserve that too." Sarah smiled as she held the phone to her ear. "We both do." A week later, Jake invited Lily over to his apartment for dinner. He had been learning how to cook, another one of his new projects, and wanted to share the results with her. He had never been a great cook, but it felt important to him to show Lily that he could be the kind of father who took initiative, who made an effort. When Lily walked in, she raised an eyebrow at the table, which was set with a mismatched array of plates, utensils, and glasses. "Dad, did you really make all this yourself?" she asked, amused. Jake grinned. "Yep, I did. And trust me, it's a work in progress. But I figured it was time to try something new." As they sat down to eat, the conversation turned from small talk to something deeper. They talked about life, about what had changed since the wedding, about their hopes and dreams. For the first time in a long time, Jake didn't feel the weight of his past mistakes bearing down on him. He felt free. Free to just be there for Lily, to show up, and to listen. At the end of the night, Lily gave her father a hug, a real one this time. Not the stiff, awkward hug of years past, but one that felt natural, full of warmth. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she said softly. Jake blinked back tears, feeling a lump in his throat. "I'm proud of you too, Lily." As Sarah sat alone in her apartment later that evening, she received a text from Mia. "So how's it going? You feeling okay?" Sarah smiled to herself before typing a response. "Yeah, I think I'm finally feeling at peace with everything. It's strange, but I feel like I'm starting fresh, and I'm okay with that." Mia's reply came quickly. "I'm so proud of you, Sarah. You deserve this new chapter. And you've got this." Sarah took a deep breath and leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the past slip away just a little more. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't looking back. She was looking ahead. Have you ever had a moment when you realized it was time to move forward, even if it meant letting go of something or someone you once held dear? What did it feel like to embrace that change? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. The days following Sarah's conversation with Jake and the dinner with Lily felt like a strange yet promising turning point in their lives. Both Sarah and Jake had been living in the shadows of the past for so long that the bright, unfamiliar light of the future was almost disorienting. Still, they both knew it was time to step forward. For Jake, that meant continuing to show up for his daughter in ways he never had before. For Sarah, it meant reclaiming her independence, rediscovering the parts of herself she'd buried for too long. For the first time in years, Sarah found herself looking at life with a fresh perspective, one that wasn't tainted by regret. Her career had been flourishing, but now she was beginning to pay more attention to the small joys in life. Those little things she had once neglected. One evening, while walking to a park near her apartment, Sarah realized how peaceful it felt just to be present in the moment. The trees were beginning to change color, the sky was that perfect shade of blue, and there was a crispness to the air that signaled fall was near. It was in this moment, as she sat on a bench in the park, that she allowed herself to breathe. Her phone buzzed, snapping her back to reality. It was a text from her mom, the first she had received in weeks. "How are you doing, Sarah? Just wanted to check in. I'm proud of how far you've come." The warmth in her mother's words made Sarah smile. They had never been close, but this felt like the start of something new. An unspoken understanding that they could both be better, stronger, and more supportive. Sarah had taken so many steps on her own, but it felt good knowing her mom noticed and cared. Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Mia. "Want to grab dinner tomorrow? We need a catch-up session." Sarah couldn't help but smile. Mia had been there for her through everything, her pain, her growth, and her journey toward moving on. Mia had been the one who reminded her that life was about living in the present, not constantly reflecting on what could have been. She texted back quickly. "I'd love that. Let's do it." Jake, on the other hand, was feeling the pressure of his efforts to rebuild his relationship with Lily. It wasn't that he regretted trying. It was just that it wasn't happening as quickly as he had hoped. Each time he thought they had made progress, a wall would go up. A quiet distance would form between them, and Jake would find himself feeling like a stranger all over again. He was trying, but the silence between them often felt like a heavy weight. One evening, after a therapy session where he spoke candidly about his fears and his past mistakes, Jake decided to give Lily some space to talk about her own feelings. He invited her over for a casual dinner, hoping it might help bridge the gap between them. Lily entered the apartment, and immediately Jake could see something was different. Her smile wasn't as wide, her posture not as open as it had been the last time they'd spent time together. There was a palpable tension in the air. "Hey, everything okay?" Jake asked gently, trying not to sound too concerned, but the worry crept into his voice. Lily nodded, but there was an unreadable expression on her face. "Yeah, I'm okay. I've been thinking a lot about everything, Dad. I've been thinking about us. About you." Jake's heart thudded in his chest, his throat tightening. "What about us? About me?" Lily paused, looking away for a moment. It was as though she was searching for the right words. "I don't know. It's hard. It's been really hard for me. You've made so many changes, and I appreciate it. I really do." But I've got my own life now, and I don't want to keep looking back at the past. It's not healthy for either of us. Jake's heart dropped. Lily, I never wanted you to feel that way. I just wanted to show up for you, to be here for you. Lily exhaled, as if releasing years of pent-up frustration. I know, but sometimes it feels like I'm just supposed to forget everything that happened. Like I'm supposed to just forgive and pretend it's all okay. But it's not. Jake's breath caught in his throat. I'm sorry. I never meant to make you feel like that. Lily met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and resolve. I know, Dad, but I think it's time for both of us to stop pretending. I've spent so much time trying to make everything okay, and I need to start being real with myself. I can't keep living in the past. The weight of her words hit Jake like a ton of bricks. He'd always known this conversation was inevitable, but hearing it now, he wasn't ready. His throat felt tight, and a lump formed in his chest. I understand, Lily, he whispered, his voice raw. I'm sorry for all the pain I caused you. Lily sat down, and there was a long, uncomfortable silence between them. For the first time in a long while, Jake realized that what they had, or what they hoped to rebuild, might not be enough. It wasn't just about him showing up or trying harder. It was about facing the consequences of his absence, and that was something that, no matter how much he tried, might never fully be fixed. Finally, Lily spoke again, quieter this time. I think we both need to let go, Dad, of what we thought this could be. The next day, as Jake walked to work, his mind kept returning to his conversation with Lily. The finality of her words lingered in his chest, heavy and bittersweet. He had tried. He had done everything he could, and yet, sometimes, trying wasn't enough. Maybe their relationship wasn't going to be what he had always imagined. Maybe it was never meant to be. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't giving up. He had learned the hard way that healing, whether for himself or for others, took time. And he wasn't ready to stop trying. For Lily, for himself, he was willing to face whatever came next. Later that evening, Sarah met Mia at the restaurant. They embraced warmly, and Sarah could see that her best friend was as lively as ever. Mia had a way of making everything seem brighter, even when life was complicated. I've been waiting for this all week, Mia said as they sat down, her smile wide. So, tell me, how are you really doing? Sarah exhaled, feeling the weight of the question. I'm doing better than I have in years, she admitted. I've been focusing on work, but I've also been giving myself some time to just be, to figure out what's next. Mia nodded. And Jake? Jake and I talked, Sarah said softly. And I think I'm finally starting to accept that some things just can't be fixed. We've both changed, and as much as we tried to make things work, maybe it's just time for both of us to move on. We can't go back to what we were. Mia gave a thoughtful nod. I think you're right. You've grown so much, Sarah. You don't need him to define your future. You've got this. Sarah smiled at her friend's words, feeling a sense of peace settle inside her. Maybe moving on didn't mean forgetting. It just meant choosing to live for herself, choosing to embrace the future without the past holding her back. Have you ever had to let go of a relationship or a dream that you held onto for too long? What helped you find the strength to move forward? Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear how you navigated your own crossroads. Sarah sat in her office the next morning, looking out at the bustling city below. The weight of the conversation with Mia lingered in her thoughts, but today felt different. It was as if the weight of all the years she had spent questioning herself, feeling torn between past mistakes and future possibilities, was slowly lifting. She no longer felt trapped by the things she couldn't change. She was moving forward, and that felt like the most empowering thing she had done in a long time. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her reverie. It was an email from the board of the nonprofit she had been working with for the past few months. They were offering her a promotion, one that she hadn't even considered. The thought of leading a larger team, of becoming the face of the nonprofit's expansion into new cities, felt like a door opening in front of her. It was the opportunity she had worked for, but it also meant a bigger commitment and more challenges ahead. Sarah hesitated for a moment before hitting reply, a smile tugging at her lips as she typed her acceptance. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but she was finally taking the reins. Jake, meanwhile, was still struggling with the aftermath of his conversation with Lily. He had tried to give her space, but the silence that had followed felt unbearable. He couldn't help but wonder if he was doomed to repeat his past mistakes, forever haunted by the idea that he wasn't good enough to fix the broken relationships he had left behind. It was a constant ache, a reminder that, despite all his efforts, the wounds of the past were not so easily healed. However, Jake was not one to back down easily. His thoughts drifted back to his military service. The same determination that had carried him through the darkest moments in combat was now fueling his desire to rebuild his life. It wasn't just for Lily anymore. It was for him, too. As if on cue, his phone buzzed. It was an invitation to an upcoming veterans event, a gathering of former soldiers, offering a chance to reconnect and support one another. Jake had avoided such events in the past, but something about this one felt different. Perhaps it was the opportunity to confront his past on his terms. He'd often hidden from the memories of war, buried them beneath layers of guilt and shame. But now, with the chance to meet others who had shared similar experiences, maybe this was his chance to find some peace. Without thinking twice, Jake RSVP'd for the event. The day of the event arrived, and Jake walked into the Veterans Hall with a mix of nervousness and anticipation. The room was filled with familiar faces, men and women who had fought in different wars, but shared a common bond. Some were older, others were younger, but they all carried the invisible scars of their service. As Jake made his way through the room, he was greeted with warm handshakes and hearty backslaps. He didn't know many of them personally, but the camaraderie was undeniable. They shared stories, not just of battles fought, but of lives rebuilt after the war. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt a sense of belonging. At the far end of the hall, he noticed a woman standing alone, her posture confident yet distant. She was older than most of the others, with sharp features and an air of quiet strength that immediately drew Jake's attention. He had seen her at a few events before, but they had never spoken. Intrigued, Jake made his way over to her. "Hi, I'm Jake," he said, extending his hand. "I don't think we've met before." The woman looked up, her eyes cool but not unfriendly. She studied him for a moment before shaking his hand. "Sarah," she replied simply, her voice calm yet firm. Jake couldn't place it, but something about Sarah felt different from the other veterans he had met. Maybe it was her quiet confidence, or the way she carried herself, but there was a depth to her that intrigued him. As they talked, Jake learned that she was a combat medic, one of the few women who had served in the same theater of war he had. She had seen and done things most people couldn't begin to imagine. Over the next hour, Jake found himself drawn into a conversation with Sarah about their shared experiences in the military. Unlike many of the other veterans, Sarah didn't focus on the glory of battle or the heroism. It was more about the raw reality of the toll it took, physically and mentally. They spoke about the guilt of losing comrades, the struggles of reintegration, and the constant feeling of being haunted by their pasts. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully, "it's funny. We spend so much time fighting to survive in war, but when we come home, we have to fight to survive in a world that doesn't really understand what we went through." Jake nodded, feeling a connection he hadn't felt in a long time. "Yeah, it's like we're fighting the same battle, but no one can see it." For the first time, Jake felt like someone truly understood the depth of what he had experienced. In that moment, Sarah's presence was both grounding and liberating. She didn't offer empty reassurances, but her understanding provided a sense of solace Jake hadn't realized he needed. As the evening wore on, Jake realized something important. There were people out there who could relate to his struggles, people who had fought their own battles, and somehow, those shared experiences made the pain a little more bearable. Sarah wasn't just another soldier. She was someone who had carried her own wounds and emerged stronger. He felt a renewed sense of hope. Maybe his own journey was just beginning, and maybe, just maybe, there was someone out there who could help him navigate the road ahead. Later that night, after the event had wrapped up, Sarah and Jake exchanged contact information before parting ways. "I'll see you around, Jake," Sarah said, her voice calm but assured. "I hope so," Jake replied with a smile. "Take care." As he walked out of the hall, Jake felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. For the first time in a long time, He wasn't thinking about his failures or the things he couldn't change. Instead, he was thinking about the future, about new connections and new opportunities. And perhaps, with Sarah's help, he might just find a way to heal the wounds that had once felt too deep to mend. Have you ever met someone who changed the course of your life with just one conversation? What did they teach you? Share your story below, and let's start a conversation about how meaningful connections can lead to unexpected growth. The weeks after the veterans event passed in a blur for Jake. The sense of peace that had settled over him since meeting Sarah lingered, and for the first time in ages, he found himself feeling more grounded. The connection they had shared was unexpected, but it felt real. Sarah had become a lifeline for him, someone who understood the depth of his struggles and never judged him for them. Their conversations over the following weeks became more frequent. They talked about everything: life after war, their experiences raising children, the fear of never fully healing, and the challenges of navigating a world that often felt disconnected from their reality. Sarah had become a reminder to Jake that, no matter how broken he felt, he was not alone in his struggles. One rainy afternoon, after another long conversation, Sarah suggested something that Jake hadn't considered before. "You know," Sarah said over the phone, "I've been thinking. We've both spent so much time looking back, trying to make sense of everything that happened. But maybe it's time we start looking forward. What do you think?" Jake was quiet for a moment, unsure of how to respond. The idea of looking forward was both exciting and terrifying. For years, he had been so focused on fixing his past mistakes that the thought of embracing the future felt like a distant dream. "I don't know," Jake finally replied, his voice thoughtful. "It's just, sometimes, it feels like the past is too heavy. Like no matter how much I try, I can't escape it." Sarah's voice was steady, reassuring. "Jake, the past will always be a part of us. But it doesn't have to define us. We can choose how we move forward. The future isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning from it and using it to build something better." Her words resonated deeply with him. He thought about Lily, about the daughter he had failed, about all the people he had let down. But now, with Sarah's encouragement, he saw the possibility of creating new chapters in his life. He could still be a father, a friend, and even someone who found joy in things he had never allowed himself to enjoy before. "What if we started by doing something different?" Jake suggested. "What if we went on a trip, just the two of us? A chance to escape from everything and just be." Sarah laughed softly, a sound that brought warmth to Jake's heart. "A trip? You and me? That's bold, Jake." "I know," Jake replied with a chuckle. "But maybe it's exactly what we both need. A way to put the past behind us, even if just for a little while." They agreed to plan a weekend getaway to a small coastal town. It was a place neither of them had ever been, a quiet spot far from the distractions of daily life. It wasn't about running away from their problems. It was about taking the time to breathe, to reconnect with themselves, and to rediscover what it meant to live in the moment. The weekend arrived faster than either of them expected. Jake found himself packing a suitcase, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He wasn't sure what to expect from the trip or what would come of it, but there was something liberating about the idea of stepping outside of his comfort zone. When they met up at the train station, Sarah was already there, her suitcase in hand, her eyes bright with anticipation. It was easy to see that she shared his sense of adventure, and despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, the excitement between them was palpable. They boarded the train together, exchanging stories and laughing about the absurdity of their lives. They spent the hours during the journey talking about everything and nothing: life, love, their children, the future, the past. For the first time in a long time, Jake wasn't thinking about his failures. He was simply enjoying the present moment, grateful for the company and the ease of being with someone who didn't make him feel like he had to be anything other than himself. When they arrived in the coastal town, the air was crisp, the sea salty and fresh. They walked along the beach, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore filling the silence between them. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt heavy. It was peaceful, as if the world had slowed down just for them. Later that evening, they sat at a small cafe by the water, the warm glow of the lights casting a soft ambience. Over dinner, Jake finally opened up about his fears. His fear of never being enough, of always falling short. It was the first time he had truly shared his vulnerability with someone in a long time, and he wasn't sure what to expect. But Sarah listened intently, offering him no judgment, only understanding. "I'm not perfect, Sarah," Jake admitted, his voice quiet. "And I don't know if I'll ever be, but I want to try. I want to be better, not just for Lily, but for myself, too." Sarah reached across the table, placing her hand on his. "Jake, you don't need to be perfect. You just need to be present. The fact that you're trying means more than you know." For the first time in years, Jake felt the weight of his past begin to lift. Sarah's kindness, her wisdom, and her acceptance of him for who he was had given him the courage to look toward the future with hope. Maybe it wasn't too late to rebuild his relationships, to be a better father, to be a better version of himself. The next morning, as they walked along the beach, Sarah turned to Jake with a thoughtful expression. "I think this is what I needed too," she said softly. "A reminder that the world is still full of possibilities, that there's always room for change." Jake smiled, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. Maybe it's not about finding the perfect solution. Maybe it's just about taking one step forward at a time. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the waves. It was a moment of clarity, a moment when both of them realized that their pasts didn't have to define them. They had the power to shape their futures, one decision at a time. Back in the city, as the weeks passed, both Sarah and Jake began to see the fruits of their journey. Sarah's new role at the nonprofit was more fulfilling than she could have imagined, and her confidence continued to grow. Jake, too, found himself making strides in his relationship with Lily, no longer holding on to the past but moving forward with patience and understanding. And though they both still faced challenges, they had discovered something invaluable: the strength to keep going, the courage to embrace change, and the knowledge that, no matter where life took them, they weren't alone. What's one thing you've learned from your past that has helped shape your future? How have you found the strength to keep moving forward, even when things felt uncertain? Share your thoughts below, and let's continue this conversation about growth, change, and the power of new beginnings.